Today, I am here with Judy Clary at her home in Woodstock, Georgia. This is Tracy Drummond, Archivist for the Southern Labor Archives, and I'm here to interview Judy for the Grady School of Nursing Oral History Project. It is the 25th of January, 2016. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Tracy.
And I want to say I'm so excited because you're really, our conversation is really how this project got started. Remember that fateful phone call a few years ago where you followed up about something you'd seen in the reading room when y'all were getting ready for the Grady School of Nursing reunion. And I was like, hey, why don't we do oral histories? I think it's a great idea. I'm still so excited about this.
I was so glad that we connected because I'm passionate about preserving the history of this School of Nursing.
Yes. And it's great. And I've learned so much from you for the last few years, and I've seen you work really hard on reunions and the history and getting stuff together. And I'm glad to get a little bit of your history today.
Okay.
So the question I always start with is, where and when were you born?
Okay. I was born February 4th, 1950 in Wilmington, Delaware.
Okay. And what did your parents do? What were they doing up in Delaware?
My father, at that time when I was born, was working for his father, who owned a dry cleaner's business. And my mother was a registered nurse. And my father, soon after I was born, joined the Marine Corps. And the rest of my life at home, he was a United States Marine. So we traveled all over the country. And my mother worked a little bit here and a little bit there as an RN. And that's where we got started in Wilmington, Delaware. But we didn't stay there long.
Okay. Do you know how they met?
Yes, my mother took her uniforms to the dry cleaners. And my father thought she was pretty special when she come in with her white uniforms and started talking to her, and that's how they met.
Okay. And do you have any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have an older sister. She is a CPA, now retired. I'm second, and then I have identical twin brothers who are 5 years younger than me. And one is a clinical psychologist, and the other is a computer expert. And then I have a younger sister who's 10 years younger than me, and she's also an RN.
Okay, so with the exception of one brother, this sort of, the healthcare field sort of has run through the family.
The older sister and one brother, yes.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
okay. And so was that intentional? Was that your mom really sort of beating it into you, for lack of a better way?
Right.
Not that she would actually have done that. That this is, or did you just see how much she enjoyed her career, or did you find it a calling, or what got you to decide you wanted to be a nurse?
I didn't know what I wanted to be. I was a good student. I actually graduated a year early from high school. I had enough credits and enough to graduate early. I took accelerated courses. My sister was 13 months older than me, and we moved around a lot because my father was in the Marine Corps. And the Vietnam War was going on when we were in high school, and he was in Vietnam. And I made a conscious decision that I needed to graduate from high school early to not have to have my senior year in another school. We spent 2 or 3 years in one location, then we moved again. And he was coming back from Vietnam when I was at the beginning of my junior year of high school, when the decision had to be made if I was going to graduate that year or go on for my senior year. And he was going to get out because they were going to send him back to Vietnam. He had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and had survived. And he had 5 children, and the oldest was ready to go to college, and he decided he had to get out to survive and to send his children to college. So instead of moving my senior year and starting in another school, I was able to just accelerate a little more, and my sister and I graduated together. I didn't know what I wanted to do because that was a quick choice to decide you'd want to get out. I knew I wanted to do something of service. My mother never pushed us to do anything at all. She enjoyed her career, but she pretty much was a housewife and only worked when finances got bad and would go to work and work the night shift, and my aunt would come babysit us when my father was overseas. The Marine Corps does not allow families to travel when they go overseas. A lot of people don't know that. So the family has to stay behind, and the Marine goes overseas, and it becomes a financial burden. It really does. It's not cheap to have two households or things going on, even though, he could live in the barracks and things like that. So my mother would always have to go back and work the night shift at the hospitals when he was overseas about every 2 years. And then when he'd come back to the States and have a stateside job, in a base somewhere, she would not work because she had 5 kids. Mm-hmm. And so she never pushed it, whatever, and I couldn't decide what to do. And, you take all these counseling and tests to see what your aptitude was. And my aptitude was anything. I was good in math, I was good in science, I was good in English. I was a straight A student. I graduated number 3, even though I graduated early. I surpassed the other kids. My sister graduated number 2 in the class. We were scholars. Mm-hmm. And so I could do anything. I decided I wanted to be a doctor and went to the counselor, and the counselor discouraged me from doing that and said, you just can't afford it. And I said, well, there's scholarships and all that. And in those days, there weren't enough scholarships for women. She said, why don't you look at nursing? And I told her, well, my mom's a nurse. And my mom said, you need to be a doctor, not a nurse. You're a leader. You're smart enough. You can do it. And we just couldn't get the money. So nursing was kind of a fallback. Once I went into it, it was okay. But I always regretted not going on to medical school. I really did. And so it was kind of a fallback thing for me to do.
Okay. So was that at a time when women generally were not, because you said there weren't a lot of scholarships for women.
Not to medical school.
Not to medical school.
Mm-hmm.
And so
my family had no money. Mm-hmm. I had to get scholarships even to go to Grady. Mm-hmm. And my sister got a full ride to Agnes Scott, and I could not get that much money. Mm-hmm. And my parents had no money. So my dad went to the bank, and to go to Grady cost $600 for the first year, $300 for the second year, and $300 for the third year. And he borrowed $300 for me, and the other $300 I got a small scholarship from the Navy's Wives Club. People back then didn't help you find scholarships, and we didn't know where to find them. And the counselors in the school really discouraged the women from doing more than just being a teacher or a nurse or something like that. They really did.
Were the counselors male or female?
It was actually a female.
Okay, and so
she helped my sister get her scholarship, but she wasn't willing to help me get one.
Well, your sister went to an all-girls school.
Exactly.
And so certainly she maybe, okay.
And they had a connection with Agnes Scott.
Okay.
3 girls from our class went to Agnes Scott on full scholarship.
Okay.
Nursing just wasn't on the radar, or medical school wasn't on the radar, except for the men at that school. Mm-hmm. 3 guys that graduated from that class went to medical school, but they all had family money. Every single one of them had a way.
And tell me again, what city were you in?
Beaufort, South Carolina.
Beaufort, South Carolina. Okay.
Very southern, very traditional, very traditional.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that that's how I ended up going to nursing school.
Okay. So let's step back just a second. You said that you and your sister were scholars, and it sounds like you both really loved school and really excelled in school. Was that sort of the priority then when you guys were growing up for your education, was to really just
Education was an absolute priority. My father was also a scholar, and he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And what happened to him is he got a full ride to Colgate, kind of an Ivy League school. And while he was at Colgate, he did so well, Yale offered him a full ride. So he called his parents, and his father was very domineering. And my father was the oldest of three boys. And his father said, no, you need to quit school because I'm going to open up a dry cleaning business and you need to run it. And you cannot go to Yale. And they were a strict Irish Catholic family, and they followed whatever the father said. Biggest mistake, he's told me many, many times in his life, was not saying no to his father. So he came home and he ran the dry cleaner business and gave up his college education. Because of that, he stressed, we are not to give up education and we are to do well in school because it's the only way out of some of this stuff. Unfortunately, the dry cleaning business went bankrupt. And then my father joined the Marine Corps, and he excelled in the Marine Corps. He did very well, and he was the highest ranking non-commissioned officer in the Marine Corps when he retired. And they kept offering him a commission to be an officer, and he chose not to. And I don't know why. He never could explain to me why, but he was absolutely brilliant. Okay. He was absolutely brilliant. So he stressed a college education. I got a brother who's Phi Beta Kappa. You know, we got MBAs. You know, everybody got a college education, all 5 kids.
Okay. And what was, on your mom's side of the family, sort of what was her background and her...
She is the only person in her family who ever went on after high school. She had 4 siblings, so 5 in her family. Her mother and father, I don't know if they even had a high school education. Very, very poor, very poor. And back then, nursing school was pretty much $15 a year because you were you worked at the hospital and all of that, and it didn't cost that much. And she was smart, and she knew that was a way out. She has brothers who didn't graduate from high school and a sister who didn't graduate from high school. But she was the only one in her family who pursued anything educationally. So she knew the value of an education, but her family just didn't have that with them.
Okay. So it was very important for all of you, but then was that made more difficult moving around when you were kids?
It made it difficult in having roots somewhere, but it gave us a very strong family, a very connected family, and we knew our focus. We knew, yep, we're going to have to go to another school next year, but we're going to be the bright kids, and we're going to excel. And so we tried harder so that we wouldn't just be lost. And so we became leaders. We became, the head of the paper, the head of the annual, the officers, because we knew we had to work hard to prove ourselves in every community we were in.
Did you feel a little pressure, given that your dad was a leader in the military, to sort of go in and step into these roles as well?
Yeah, and the interesting thing, being children of a Marine, we were well disciplined, we were well behaved. None of us ever got in trouble, one iota. We knew we had to behave, but my dad loved his kids, and my mom loved her kids, and they were the absolute best parents in the world. We didn't have any money, but they do our best to take us on a camping trip or take us to Washington, D.C. or New York to educate us and see things. And so traveling and moving around the country was an added education. Okay. And that's the way we saw it, is that we're getting an education that people who stay in the same small town all their lives don't have the opportunity to do. And it also taught us how to make friends quickly and easily and not be afraid to go out into the world. So that was an added bonus. So we never resented it. We really didn't.
Okay. What are some of the places you lived?
Well, we started in Delaware and then Lakehurst, New Jersey. My dad was a meteorologist in the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps, partners with the Navy and a lot of stuff that they do. So we were almost always stationed on a Navy base because he did the weather for the Navy pilots. And so Lakehurst, New Jersey had a naval base there. And actually when we were there, that's where the Hindenburg crashed. And they still had the blimps when I was there in kindergarten and first through third grade. And the blimps would fly over our house, and he was the weatherman for all the people that did that. So that was the first place I remembered. And then he got transferred to California, and he was at Quantico, California. And my parents never wanted us to live on base. They wanted us to live in the community. So we lived in Anaheim, and we were in Anaheim when Disneyland, the first one opened. And we didn't have any money, but my parents knew how important that was. And my mother took my sister and I was 5 and she was 6, to the opening day of Disneyland, and Walt Disney shook my hand.
Wow.
So we got to explore and to see the world and do some things. So we were there for my kindergarten, and then my dad got transferred to the Philippines, so we came back to Delaware. That's what we'd always do. Whenever he was overseas, we would come back to Wilmington, where my mother and father's family were, so they had that support. So we came back to Delaware and stayed there until his next assignment. And his next assignment was back to New Jersey. So we went back to New Jersey. And then we eventually ended up in Beaufort, South Carolina when I was in 7th grade. And at that point, my dad pretty much told them, my kids are getting old enough. Don't transfer me back and forth anymore. I'd like them to get, their high school education in one school. And they were good to him because he was really good in the Marine Corps and he was well respected. But we stayed there when he went to Vietnam. We did not go back north that time. And we stayed when he was in Vietnam. And then he'd had 21 years in, and like I said, they were ready to send him back to Vietnam. The war wasn't over, and he said no, so he retired at that point.
Okay. So he must have, when he was in the Philippines?
And several tours in Japan, too.
Okay. Certainly, you mentioned earlier that it was a financial burden on the family when things like that would happen. But as you were an older kid when you went to Vietnam, and you had a better understanding of what was going on. So what was it like being the child of a parent who was in this very dangerous situation?
Well, we had other kids whose dads, because we lived where there was Parris Island and Beaufort Naval Air Station. Beaufort was a Marine Corps Air Station, and Parris Island were like 20 miles from each other. So it was a big military town. So we were not alone in that.
Okay.
There were many of our friends whose parents were also serving in Vietnam. And eventually my classmates served in Vietnam because the war took so long, and here I was in high school, that I had some that graduated and went and died, whatever. So, it was okay. My dad was at Da Nang, and we knew he wasn't shooting a gun. He was doing the weather for the pilots and all of that, and we knew he wasn't on the front line. And I think that's what kind of kept us calm. And we knew he was okay. We just felt Dad would be okay. Unfortunately, he was sprayed with Agent Orange, and he later died from the effects of it, even though he wasn't on the front line from his Vietnam experience. It took many years, but it did happen.
But being in a community with so many military families, certainly other people did have losses that your family would not have. So what's it like being in a community of loss, especially for such a misunderstood war?
It was okay there because the community, the civilians, the non-military families respected us, and they did not have any kind of demonstrations against the war in those towns because the military bases supported the economy, and they knew better than to do that. So we were not in a situation like some other places. like Kent State or something like that, where people were saying, you're a baby killer and all that kind of stuff. We never saw that.
Okay.
We absolutely never saw it. We would see it on TV and just be amazed because that community respected the military. So it was not bad at all. It really wasn't.
Okay. So you wanted to be a doctor, and your guidance counselor just said no.
Discouraged me.
Discouraged you.
Right. And I just didn't know how to get any money or do anything. So I just decided, well, you know what? I need to make a living.
How did you learn about Grady? Was that your first choice?
Yes, it was. Well, I take that back. Johns Hopkins was my first choice. My mother said, once I decided I was going to be a nurse, I said, I'd like to go to the school you went to, which was still in Wilmington, Delaware Hospital, just like Grady, big city hospital, whatever. And my mother said, Johns Hopkins is the best, Judy, and you can go to Johns Hopkins. She says, if they'll figure out a way you can afford it. Well, I wrote to Johns Hopkins and I wrote to my mother's school, and neither of them wrote me back. And so we had career day at school. And Savannah School of Nursing came, Medical College of Charleston came, and Grady came. And so I went around and I talked to all of them. And Grady had the most welcoming, interesting person, Nancy Wooten, who was the registrar. And she just knew how to sell it. And 3 of us from our class all chose Grady over all the other schools. And no one went to any of the other schools that year because we wanted to come to Atlanta, a big city. Grady was affordable. We knew we could figure out a way to pay for it, and that we knew the experience we would get at Grady was so much better than some of these other places. You would see everything at Grady, and you could do anything when you graduated from Grady. She convinced us of that, and she was right. She was absolutely right. So Grady was the only place I actually ended up applying to, and I was, admitted.
And your older sister went where?
She went to Agnes Scott and hated it.
But did she finish there?
No.
No, okay.
She went to Agnes Scott for 1 year.
Okay.
And she absolutely hated it. And so she left Agnes Scott. And by then my dad had retired from the military and moved to Florida. And so she was able to get in-state tuition to Florida State. And so she went to Florida State, and that's where she ended up staying.
That's where she got her nursing degree.
No, she's not a nurse. This is the CPA.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, she's the CPA.
Okay.
Right.
I'm sure your parents felt better, though, with both of you being in close proximity, at least at first.
Yeah.
That she was in Decatur and that you were in Atlanta.
Exactly.
So what was it like on your own in the big city for the first time? And you graduated early, so you were...
I was 17.
You were 17.
I was 17.
So what was that?
It was fine because we were sheltered.
Okay.
And we had so many rules and regulations that it was absolutely fine. I loved it. I loved it from the minute I went for my interview and saw the hospital, and they let you spend the night in the dorm and meet other students and talk to them and have your physical and go through the whole application process. And then we all walked up to Georgia State and took the admission exams at Georgia State because we had to be admitted to Georgia State as well as Grady, because all our collegiate courses were done at Georgia State. So I loved Georgia State. But it was an easy walk, and it was fun to be with other students, and the whole atmosphere, just loved it from the minute I got there. Loved my roommate. She was from Marietta, Georgia, had never been anywhere in her life. Her mother was very protective. Her mother was sitting on the bed with her when I got there and introduced ourselves, and my mother took me, and we introduced ourselves, and Charlene's mother looked at my mother and she says, I want you to know that Charlene is a good girl and she's a good student. I hope your daughter is. And my mother didn't take offense at it, and she says, oh, good, because that's exactly what Judy is too. And her mother relaxed. And Charlene and I laugh about it now, and we go, and we were. She was a good student too, so we hit it off, so it was fine. I loved everything about it. I loved being in the city. I loved being able to walk downtown to Rich's and Davison's, which were back then. Didn't have any money, but it was fun to look, that kind of stuff. So it was fine.
And so would you say that moving around as, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as the daughter of someone in the military, sort of prepared you for this move?
Oh yeah, I had no problem. But we had many who were just absolutely mortified and scared to death. They had never been out of the town. They had never slept in a bedroom with someone other than themselves. Didn't even have a brother or sister. I never had a room to myself ever. So to me, it was just, it was fine. Yeah.
So what were the first days like there, getting sort of situated? And
it was pretty hectic. Orientation, pretty much. You didn't have your uniform yet. You didn't have any of that. You couldn't go in and do any patient care yet. So it was just, getting you started into the routine. So you started your classes at Georgia State, and the first year was the toughest year because you had to take 2 courses at Georgia State and your nursing courses at Grady and work at the hospital. So it was a full week. It was a 40-hour week, literally. And I did fine. I did fine at Georgia State. I got good grades and all of that. And girls were flunking out left and right. They couldn't handle the chemistry. They couldn't handle the anatomy and physiology. Buford High School was a good high school. And I took chemistry and all that stuff there, and I had no problem with the courses at Georgia State. So I was fine. And then once I met my husband, like he was my second date there, I had a social life. So it just worked out just beautifully. It just really did. We had to learn, how to behave. They gave us a lot of rules and regulations. We had curfew. You had to be in your room at 7 o'clock at night, Monday through Friday, or in the library. And study time was from 7 to 9. Once you got to the library at 7, you couldn't leave till 9. And if you were in your room at 7, you couldn't be out in the hall. You couldn't be in someone else's room. You had to be in your room studying from 7 to 9. Now, what you did behind the closed doors was up to you. And Charlene and I were good students, and we took it seriously, and so we studied. Some people didn't, and they were gone by Christmas because it was tough to get everything done. Once we had enough little classes on basic nursing and stuff like that, they finally let us start practicing on each other, giving each other bed baths and taking temperatures and blood pressures and all of that, in a big lab. And, that was fun. We just couldn't wait to get into the hospital. We just couldn't wait. The only time we were in the hospital was maybe definitely to go eat. We ate all our meals there, or a classroom was in the hospital and we'd have a class there or something like that. So it started a little slow on the nursing part, and it was more the Georgia State English, anatomy and physiology, chemistry, sociology, all those courses, and then a basic nursing course. And so once we finished the first quarter, we had quarters back then, we finally got our uniforms. That was the most exciting day ever. We got our caps, and we felt like we were really nursing students then. We were so proud of those uniforms and caps. And so then when we went into the hospital, we'd wear our uniforms, and we felt like we were part of it. So that was a big thing. Before then, you couldn't tell who we were, whatever. And then we started to get more, a little experience with patients and stuff like that.
So how close was the dorm to the hospital?
Oh, not even a football field length.
Okay.
I mean, the dorm is across the street. They had
across which street?
And the hospital fronted on Butler Street, and then on one side was Armstrong Street. And on Armstrong Street there was Hirsch Hall, which was a dorm, and there was Armstrong Hall, which was another dorm, and just in the back of Armstrong Hall was Piedmont Hall, and that's where I was. So I literally would walk through the courtyard between the 2 dorms back into Armstrong, and I was on Armstrong Street then, and just literally walk, 300 yards, and I was in the front door of the hospital. Okay. It's that close. Yeah, it's right there.
Were the dorms integrated by the time?
Yes, when I went, our class was fully integrated. So I had, I want to say, about 8 black girls in my class, and we were assigned alphabetically to our roommates. But they let people know right away if they had a problem, let people know. And it was interesting because some of the white girls and black girls were put together, and it wasn't the white girls who asked to be taken away from the black girls. The black girls were as afraid of the white girls as anything, and they were uncomfortable. So they asked to have a black roommate. I think they were afraid they were going to be treated differently, maybe, or something. But then once they got to know them, they kind of like said, oh, we didn't need to do that, because we all got along. We had no problem. We had no strife whatsoever. We had 2 men who were in our class. The first male entered in 1965, and he was a senior when we entered as freshmen. So they were the next 2. They were like number 2 and 3 that ever got entered, and they lived where the radiological techs lived in another dorm. So they were not, it was not a male-female dorm. It was all female.
Okay.
And there were only 2 men.
Okay. So was there any sort of training or workshops, anything like that in place for people who maybe did not come from fully integrated places to sort of go and...
Like some diversity training or something like that?
This is what we would call it now. And,
right.
Yeah, but maybe...
No.
Nothing? Okay.
Nothing at all.
Okay.
Nothing at all.
Okay.
Yeah. And...
Because you started in 68.
67. And, you know, I had been in integrated schools all my life until 7th grade when we moved to Beaufort, South Carolina. And when I went to school the very first day on the bus, we passed a school. And it was all black students out in the courtyard, and the bus kept going. And I said to the person next to me, why didn't we stop at the school? And they let us off, and they go, that's not our school. And I said, what do you mean that's not our school? That's the closest school. And they said, that's the black school. I literally didn't know about segregation. So when I got to the school, and it was all white, and then I got on the bus and went home and passed the black school again, I asked my parents, I said, what's going on in this place? Did you know they have a school just for black people and our school is just for white people? And my parents said, yeah, but we really didn't think about it because you grew up, you know, whatever. And we were just shocked. We were absolutely shocked. So when school started to be integrated and I was in high school, the school opened it up and they made it voluntary. You didn't have to. They didn't just kind of cross-mix anybody. They made it voluntary. You can go to whichever school you want. Well, all the whites, of course, picked the white school, and 4 blacks picked to go to the white school, but only 4.
Was it because it was closer, or do you think...
They were handpicked. They were the test.
Really?
They were.
That's a lot of pressure on a kid.
It was a tremendous amount of pressure. It was 1 guy and 3 girls. And they were leaders, and they were smart, and they were good students. And I was my sister was the editor of the newspaper, and I was the social editor of the newspaper. She was the head editor, and I worked under her. And we went to them and asked them to come work on the newspaper so that we would get their story in the newspaper and we would get their perspective. And they were wary at first, and we told them our history. Look, we didn't grow up in segregated schools. We're in the military. We don't have any problem with this. We'll treat you right. If you work hard and you want to do it, you've got a position on the newspaper. And they accepted it. And people were shocked. And it worked out fine. And so they would write articles, and we would write articles, and people start to know people are people, you know. So it went very smoothly that year, but we made an effort to do it. We really did.
How did the community in general feel about it? Did you sort of get a...
I was isolated from the true blue bloods. That wasn't my social group.
Right.
Mine were the military kids.
Okay.
So I didn't see it. I know it went on. Unfortunately, while I was there, one of the prominent family in the town's daughter was raped by a black man. And the next day at school, the white football players were ready to go out and kill somebody and all of that. And we had a meeting in the auditorium, and literally her father came and begged for peace. He was a minister, and he did it right. And he said, "We have to forgive this. She's fine. I know you all know what happened. She'll be fine, but we're not going to do this in our town." And it calmed it down. It calmed it down. I honestly don't know what happened, if they found the man or anything. Pat Conroy, the famous writer, went to Beaufort High School, and he graduated 2 years before I graduated, so he wasn't in my social circle, but he was from a military family. His dad was the great Santini, whatever. And his books that he writes about how it was, gave me more insight than I actually had, because I was kind of isolated from it. It just wasn't part of my world. I didn't participate in it. I had friends who, were not racist in any fashion or form. So, I didn't have any experience with that.
Okay. Were the students that went to the black school, were they also from military families, or were they maybe sort of families that were there that sort of supported work on the bases? Or?
I absolutely don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if any black Marines children went there.
Okay.
I imagine they did. Now, they did have a elementary school in the housing for the Marines. Laurel Bay is a beautiful housing area by Beaufort Marine Corps Air Station, and they had their own elementary school, and it was segregated. But I was older than that. I never went there. Paris Island had its own elementary and middle school. So those students, black and white, went there. So if you didn't live in the base housing and you were a black Marine, I don't know where you sent your kids. I imagine, now that you ask it, they lived in the housing, so their kids went to the segregated school, because I just really don't know.
Okay. So back to Atlanta, where you were starting. So you were already, because you had just grown up mostly, with the exception of Beaufort, in integrated schools. It wasn't like you were coming from a small town into this situation, where there were different races of students at the dorm. Did you ever get the impression that the people who weren't doing well, because you mentioned earlier, by the end of that first quarter, people had started flunking out because they weren't good at chemistry, that it was just sort of that they were coming from smaller towns or weaker school systems? Or
I think it was a combination.
I mean, and about how many students would it, do you have an idea of how many students would have started?
Oh, I can tell you exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Around 140 were in my freshman class.
Okay.
When we came back after the Christmas break, 70. One half.
They cut it in half.
They failed. One half failed.
Okay.
We were shocked when we came into the half-empty dorm. Where is so-and-so? We did not know they failed. It was, you got your test exams, you're going home for Christmas vacation, and you came back or you didn't come back.
Do they expect that at the beginning of every school year?
It happened.
The Grady staff,
it happened every time. The number of students who couldn't cut it through the Georgia State stuff and everything that first year. If you made it past Christmas, you made it till graduation. And all 70 of us graduated.
So then that's probably why, that they didn't go in and give you uniforms and everything, that they wanted you to get through that first semester
right.
to really
to see if you were going
to stick around.
If you were going to crack down, if you were going to study. Mm-hmm. If you cracked down and studied, and we helped each other, we did. We would, anatomy and physiology to me was the hardest thing because it was so much memorization. They had 2 chemistry instructors who taught the student nurses at Georgia State at the time. And at that time, we had Crawford Long, Piedmont, and St. Joseph School of Nursing, and Georgia Baptist. And most of them sent their students to Georgia State for the same courses the Grady Girls took. Okay. So we were in classes with other student nurses from other schools, and they had a failure rate too. They couldn't get through the Georgia State stuff. Okay. Is what I think
was like
it amounted to.
For everyone.
It was. It really was. Okay.
Was that disheartening, or did that make you feel like,
it scared us? When you come back and half your class is gone, mm-hmm. you go, oh my gosh, And the girls who barely made it by the skin of their teeth finally cracked down and got the message, mm-hmm. and we helped them and said, you're getting chemistry. It depended on what group you were in, what order you took the stuff, and chemistry was the killer for most of them. Anatomy and physiology and chemistry. But the girls that didn't crack down and then had to take anatomy and physiology and chemistry were scared to death. They weren't going to make it. And so we told them and we coached them. And we said, okay, we're going to tell you what to expect. Mm-hmm. You need to study this. You need to memorize all of this. No kidding. They're going to ask you the most minute things that you think aren't important and you're never going to remember again. And so we helped each other and everybody made it. But we were scared to death. Mm-hmm. I had anatomy and physiology and trying to think the first semester. What was the second one I had? I'm thinking I had chemistry too. I had the 2 horrific ones the first semester, which looking back, I thought no wonder so many people failed in my group. But the chemistry one, I got the professor that wasn't as hard as the other one, and it was easier than my high school chemistry I had. So it really depended on which professor you got too. Some of the girls came back the next year and made sure they didn't get that one professor, and they did fine. You work the system.
Yeah. So coming back after Christmas, half the students are gone, mm-hmm. but then this is when you start, like you said, getting your uniforms
and getting to have patience.
Mm-hmm. So what was it? I mean, and you said you got to practice on each other, mm-hmm. but was there the sort of intimidation at first, like, I don't know this person and I have to touch them to take care of them?
They really worked on that. They taught you how to approach a person you didn't know, mm-hmm. how to treat them with dignity, how to keep their modesty, things like that, and how to be caring first. Number 1 is they taught you to care for that person and treat them as if they were your family. They said, if you will treat this person as if your family, they will open up to you, they will let you do things to them. And so they were very good at getting that initial fear, calmed. And then the first things you did was you just go into a room and sit down there and talk to the patient. Mm-hmm. And you would come back to a group meeting and they would test you. They'd say, okay, we're going to give you a test. See how observant you were, to teach you to be observant. So you had to put down, and we didn't know what was going to happen, the color of their eyes, their hair, about how old they were, real specific things. Did they have flowers on the bedside table, just all these details, because you were so afraid when you first went in, you weren't going to take in the details. So that first test, everybody failed. Everybody, because we were just shaking, talking to them, whatever. And they said, okay, now you learn what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to learn to go in, and you're going to have to not only focus on what you're saying, but you have to observe the patient and their mannerisms. And what did they leave over there in the corner? And things like that. You've got to take the whole room in. And they really taught us that right away. So we practiced that. We would go back to another patient, and this time we had a goal. We'd say, okay, we have to find out where they grew up, kind of like you're interviewing me, some interview techniques, and then start asking them about their illness. and how they felt about their illness and things like that, and how their family did it. So we weren't doing any nursing care, we were just talking. So we did that for, I'd say, a week or two, and we got a little more comfortable with it. And we learned real quickly, people that are sick, are scared and more scared than you are. And that your job is to show them, I'm not scared, I can take care of you, I'm going to be here for you. So they really worked on that. And we had excellent instructors who really taught you, how to do that. So that's the first thing. And then you finally got to go in and take temperature, a blood pressure, and a respiration. And your hand would be shaking, looking for that pulse. And the patient knew you were a student, and the patient knew you were a newbie, and the patient wanted to help you.
Right.
That kind of stuff. So that was always, the first thing. So just simple things. Just real simple things. And then you started to do just changing their sheets, and giving them a bed bath and things like that. Or just walking them down the hall. Just simple things. And then you just build on that.
Okay. You mentioned that y'all got really good training in terms of like knowing what to say and how to put the patient at ease and things like that. So did Grady, do you know... Did they? I mean, I know that they developed their own curriculum, but were they one of the? Because they were founded in 1898. Were they one of the oldest nursing schools in the country? And had they developed, or did the different professors come in from different places and bring updated methods? Can you speak to any? I mean, I know that's kind of a out there question.
Yeah, because I helped co-write the book, and my emphasis was on the beginning of the school. In 1898, there were a little over 300 nursing schools in the United States. 24 were in the South. In the South, in Georgia, they had Augusta, and they had Spelman, and they had Grady. That was it. And the model they used was the apprentice model, which was established by Florence Nightingale. And Grady actually sent women up to already established nursing schools in the North, to Roosevelt Hospital in New York City, to see how it was run. And they were a Nightingale school. Nightingale schools had a certain curriculum, a certain standard, and a certain philosophy. Now, unfortunately, when nursing schools first came about in the United States after the Civil War, most of them proliferated after the Civil War. A lot of them were just scams. A doctor would say he had a hospital because he needed people to come in and take care of his patients, and he would just bring in people with no training at all and say, I'll give you a certificate that says you're a nurse. So there wasn't a lot of good regulation at that time. Well, Florence Nightingale kind of put the end to that. And her reputation was so strong and so good, and what she did was phenomenal. She reduced the fatality rate in the Crimean War like 90%. And so people knew that was the standard they wanted, who wanted to do a good job. And Grady wanted to do a good job. So they established with a very good program to begin with, and it had a set curriculum. And it took just a couple of years to really get that curriculum set. At first, it was just a list of lectures. And the doctors would give the lectures as well as the already graduate nurses, which there were very few at that time. And they would do that in-house. And then over the years, Grady started just using the graduate nurses and the doctors continuously to do all of the educational training. Eventually, when the School of Nursing kind of separated from the nursing department at the hospital and became its own entity, they hired instructors who just did instruction of the School of Nursing. They didn't have a ward job and teach. For years and years, they had both. So they were practicing nurses on the floor and would teach a lecture or stuff like that. Now, sometimes they would have, because Grady's affiliation with Emory University goes back from the very beginning, we would have professors from Emory who would give us lectures. and things like that. And they knew the good doctors who were good teachers and would ask them to come in and do that. But not anybody else. They were the Emory doctors or the staff at Grady who did all of the curriculum and the training.
Okay. You said at the beginning there were just a small number of lectures and then the program developed. How early did it become a 3-year school?
From the very beginning, 1898, when they chartered it as a 3-year school. There's some people who think they had a 2-year school before then, and the reason they think that, and I wrote about it in the book and researched it, is like I told you, some of these hospitals gave certificates. The certificate was proof of experience. And women, it was women back then. I think there was one place that accepted men, and it was a religious order, but it was mainly women. And women, if they had to go somewhere else to work, needed something to show, I have experience. I'm a, quote, trained nurse. Didn't mean you were a diploma nurse, an RN. That didn't exist for a while. So the hospitals would issue these certificates, and they had 1-year and 2-year certificates that they would give. And it was really just proof of, yes, they were here for this period of time, and we would recommend them. So Grady had that, and we found evidence of that, but it was not a formal program, and it definitely was not a formalized school. But women had to have that. And so Grady followed that. So some people think they had a 2-year school before the 3-year school. They did not. That was the norm in the United States, to give people a certificate. So when they chartered their school in 1898, they decided they wanted it to be a good school, a formal school, and as best they could do, and that's why they went and studied the Florence Nightingale model up in whatever, and it needed to be a 3-year school. Some Florence Nightingale schools did start as a 2-year school, but Johns Hopkins kind of led the way, and they started with the 2-year school and then very quickly saw, no, it's going to take 3 years, and Grady decided, because they hired a graduate from Johns Hopkins to start the school, to have a 3-year school. Okay. So the first superintendent was in the second graduation class at Johns Hopkins, and so she knew the model to follow.
Okay. I clearly asked the right person this question. I wasn't sure if you would have an answer. That's great. Because I think for folks, well, like me, my background is not nursing, but also other folks who might use this for research, things like that are, it's good.
And
it's good to know.
There's a doctor who wrote a book about Grady Hospital, and he put in his book that Grady had a 2-year school. Okay. And that just makes Mrs. Dixon very upset that he got it wrong. I understand how he did that. And I can understand how he didn't understand that, because he didn't study how nursing schools evolved and how the training and curriculum evolved. He was just writing a story about the hospital and happened to include the School of Nursing in there. We actually found the U.S. Department of Education's annual report of 1898, and Grady is listed in it as a 3-year school, and that was the first year, so there were no graduates yet. It said how many students, and I forget the exact number, it's in the book, but it's like 15 or 18, and then how many graduates. It was a big graph with all the nursing schools in the whole United States, and there were no graduates because it was the first year.
Okay.
So we found that document.
Okay. So heading into your second semester, you started working with patients more, and you said that the hardest semester was that first.
Right.
Really to separate the students who would succeed from those who would not.
Right.
Perhaps. So now you're gaining all this confidence and all this experience. What was it like the final 2 years? Were there any difficulties? Were there any surprises at that point?
Trying to think. I just loved it. I just thrived. I loved the patients. I loved our days where we worked the whole day on the floor, and our instructors were up there with us, and our patients correlated to what we were studying. So if we were studying surgical cases, we had surgery patients. If we were studying cardiology, we had cardiology patients so that we could correlate that. And the staff at Grady that weren't part of the nursing school were tremendous. They loved the students, they respected us, they helped us, and in the past, that wasn't always the case. You can read some documentation where the head nurses were tyrants and abused the student nurses and stuff like that, and used them as slaves, essentially. We didn't get that. It was well controlled. It was not that heavy a patient load that you couldn't study, and you learned the day before who your patients were. You went up on the ward, you read the chart, you studied that diagnosis, you learned all of the medications that you're going to give, the side effects and things like that. And so you were ready when you came in the next morning to take care of the patient. I loved it when the doctors made rounds, and we had good teaching doctors at Grady because of the Emory School of Medicine, and they would go out of their way to show us stuff and teach us stuff. So the whole institution really geared on education, and I knew I'd picked the right school. I wasn't somewhere where you had easy cases and stuff like that. The harder the case, they weren't afraid to give it to the students at all. When I was in psychiatric rotation, Grady had a locked psychiatric unit. And I don't know if I've told you this story before, but back, and I might get the date wrong, it was probably about 68 or 1969, a student at Emory University by the name of Barbra Mackel got the flu. And her parents were wealthy. Her dad was a developer in Florida. And her mom came up and got a hotel room and brought her to the hotel room to help nurse her through the flu. And the flu's bad. You're sick for 2 weeks. We think we have the flu when we don't have the flu. The real flu is bad, and she had the real flu. So her mom nursed her, whatever. There was a guy by the name of Gary Stephen Christ who was very, very smart, but he was a seedy character. And he decided he was going to kidnap Barbra Jean Mackel. And he pre-planned. He was going to kidnap somebody with money at Emory. And he pre-planned this. And he built an underground grave out in Gwinnett County near Berkeley Lake. You've heard of this story.
But keep telling it.
Okay. And so she was the one that he could get to. So I think the mom had gone out to go get something from the grocery store or something, and he broke into the motel, and he got Barbra Jean Mackel, and he buried her alive in this underground grave. And he had water and stuff like that for her, and ventilation. He was a smart guy. And then he called the dad, and he asked for a ransom. Well, of course, the FBI got involved in all of that. And they caught him. But after they caught him, and that's a long story, whatever, it was in the news, it was on the national news, it was in Life magazine and everything. And this happened, not too far from downtown Atlanta. I was in my psychiatric rotation. And psych was my least favorite rotation of all the rotations I ever had. I knew I wasn't going to be a psychiatric nurse. I hated psychiatric nursing. I had a very hard time dealing with patients who you couldn't reason with. I'm a very pragmatic person and logical person and organized person, and when you go in and they're Jesus Christ and they're telling you you're going to die and go, oh gosh, get me out of here kind of person. So I did my time, and I walked in, and my instructor pulled me aside with the head nurse, and they said, we got a special patient for you today. And I said, oh gosh, every patient on psychiatric board's a special patient. What do you have for me? And they said, well, we don't want you to do anything, but go in and do vital signs, take the food, change the sheets, and just make sure he's breathing and all of that, and just make sure he's stable. He's in for an evaluation. And I said, okay, what's so special about him? They said, well, you cannot go in without an armed guard. And I said, oh gosh, he must have robbed a bank or something like that. And they said, no, we're not going to tell you any of that, but just don't go in without the armed guard, and the armed guard will be at the door every time you go in. Do not go in that room without the armed guard. And I said, okay. My classmates tell me they picked me because they knew I would follow the rules. I would not sneak in and talk to him or do anything, that I was a rule follower. I was the daughter of a Marine. They knew who to pick. So I went to the door, and we had the normal security guards, and this was not a normal security guard. This was like an NFL football player guard in a suit and a tie. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you the guard?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." I said, "Okay, I'm going to be his nurse today, and I'm not allowed to go in without you." "No, ma'am, you are not to go in that room without him." I said, "Okay." I said, "Where's your gun?" And he pulled his jacket open, and sure enough, he had a gun under there. And I said, "Okay." And I knew this guy could tackle anybody, because some of those patients, it takes like 5 men to get them calmed down, and I knew this guy could do it. So I was scared to death, and I walked in, and it looked like an 80-year-old man with a gray beard and gray hair, all curled up in a ball on the bed. And I took his vital signs and all of that, and he was fine. And I came out, and I did not find out, because they didn't tell me his real name. They had an alias for him. I did not find out till I saw it in the news the next day that Gary Stephen Christ was a patient at Grady Hospital psychiatric unit for evaluation for his legal trial. And I went, "Oh my gosh, that's my patient. And I'm 19 years old, and he kidnapped a 19-year-old student. Why would they do that to me?" I was a little upset at first, and then I thought, well, that's what nursing does to you. You don't know who your patients are going to be. You don't know if they're the good guys. You don't know if they're the bad guys. You just take them and you treat them the same, whatever. And, of course, he wasn't sick. He was just being evaluated. But that's the kind of experience you got at Grady. I couldn't get that anywhere else, and learn how to handle it. And they told me, "You are never to tell anybody he's your patient." My husband did not know he was my patient till a year ago.
Really?
When I finally felt it was safe. I was a good kid. I did not break anything, whatever. Now I tell the story because he's back in jail. He got a 10-year sentence. He served it. He went to South America and got a medical degree. He got a license in, I think it was Indiana or Illinois, and was practicing in private practice. Some of his patients recognized his name and called the state board and said, "Did you know he's a convicted whatever?" And he told the truth.
And how did that pass?
How did that pass the background check? Because they didn't do it back then. Wow. All they wanted was that medical degree, and nobody recognized the name.
Not even the medical degree, but once he came back to the States and had to get some sort of license to practice.
I know. Scary. He was smart. He knew how to be a doctor.
Yeah.
But he wasn't a good guy. The patients complained, and so they took his license away. He went to Alabama or Arkansas, I can't remember which, and I guess he bought a farm or something, and the FBI didn't trust him. And they kept eyes on him for years. They finally raided his farm, and he had a whole underground network with tunnels and rooms selling and making drugs and bringing them in. And they put him in prison, and that's where he remains today.
And I imagine he'll be there until he dies.
When I Googled him last time, they said he hasn't had his trial yet, and he's been in prison for years, and nobody's in a hurry to try him again. He's been lost in the system. So I felt it was safe to say,
yes,
he was my patient one day.
Well, if he gets out, let me know, and we'll pull the
He's not coming after me. I don't have any money for him.
And it's, I guess, worth noting for anybody that might listen that doesn't know, but if I remember correctly, the kidnapped victim was found alive.
Yes. He called, the father decided to pay the ransom, gave the ransom, and Gary Stephen Christ and his girlfriend were heading down to Florida, and I think she or he called the FBI and said, "You will find the grave at Berkeley Lake in Gwinnett County," and they found her and got her out, and she's alive today. She's still alive. He went down, he paid cash for a yacht, and the guy who sold him the yacht got suspicious and called the police, and that's how they picked him up.
Paying cash for a yacht is...
Yeah. Not many people back then paid cash.
Yeah.
And he's a squirrely looking guy anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a very exciting story that I did not expect, but certainly hints at the variety.
The variety you would get at Grady. You never knew what you were going to get.
But also you made that important point, I think, where you said you have to treat people this, even if you find them completely despicable, you have to treat people the same.
Exactly.
And
I would say 95% of the staff at Grady did that. Occasionally, we would get a gunshot victim. We had a lot of gunshot victims, and they still do to this day at Grady. And I didn't read the newspapers or watch the news. I was too busy studying, doing stuff. So it was a gunshot victim. That's all I needed to know, how to take care of this person with a gunshot wound to the abdomen. And I had a lady one time, and I was taking care of her and treated her just like any other patient. She was a gunshot wound. I didn't ask her. I didn't care how she got shot, whatever. Well, she was involved in some robbery or something, and that's how she got shot. The doctors knew it. So when they made rounds, one of the doctors treated her very brusquely and was actually cruel to her. And she was in pain. And I went back and went over his head because I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere with him, and went to the resident. And I said, Dr. So-and-so is not going to write any pain relief from her. And you and I both know she needs something stronger than what he gave her. And I think he's treated her a little too brusquely and is not giving her relief for the pain. He said, I will take care of it. Mm-hmm. And so we didn't tolerate that. But some people thought they could treat people like that, even though, interestingly, she got fined, she left, and about a year later, I was working in another whole rotation, and the head nurse came to me and they said, there's a patient acting up on a whole different floor, a whole different ward, and they can't calm her down, and she wants you. And I said, who is it? And they told me the name, and it was the lady who'd gotten the gunshot wound. And I said, oh, I remember her. And she said, I want my nurse. I want Judy Lee, and I don't want anybody else because she's the only one who treated me with dignity one day, and she wouldn't behave for them for some reason. So the staff called and found me, and so I went all the way across the hospital and went in her room, and she was there, and she was acting out. So I sat down with her, and I calmed her down, and I said, if you will give these people a chance, they're going to treat you just like I did. And you got to get this chip off your shoulder. I said, you might have had one bad experience, but I'm going to tell you, most of these people here are going to treat you fine, and I'm going to talk to them and tell them, if you treat her with dignity, she'll be a great patient. She was a great patient for me. I said, do you promise you will do that for me? Because I cannot come be your nurse. I'm a student nurse. I don't have a choice of where I can be, whatever. And she said, okay. And a student nurse calmed down the patient when everyone else couldn't. And I went back to the ward, and they said, what was that about? I said, I can't believe this. I said, they were desperate. And she said, get me Judy Lee. And she remembered my name. That's what you get in nursing.
Right. And then certainly it demonstrates that becoming a good nurse is as much about personal human interaction as it is knowing what to do and when to do it. And,
right. Right. She was scared. She was just scared.
People in hospitals usually are.
Yeah. But that's the kind of patient you get at Grady.
So with the continuing, you were continuing your studies. During this time, was there anybody that sort of stood out as a significant mentor to you? Because it sounds like in general it was a mentoring environment.
It was.
You mentored each other as students, and you had doctors and other staff.
Yeah.
But was there anybody at this time that starts to stand out as a mentor?
I would kind of gravitate to the nurses, the ones that were graduated and working that I saw were good, and try to shadow them. I didn't have any personal relationships with them, whatever. My instructors, I liked most of them. A few, weren't my favorites. Betty Blake stands out. Everybody loved Betty Blake. She ended up becoming the director of nursing at Grady after the school closed, and she was phenomenal. She was an angel. She really was. Very professional, very kind, very quiet in her demeanor. And you knew, if you had a problem, you could go to Miss Blake and you'd work it out. She was strict, and she was very demanding. When she gave you a question, you better know that answer, and you better know it deep. You couldn't give her a shallow answer whatsoever. But she stood out particularly. Geneva Boykin, her quiet manner and her way to calm people down was a great influence. She just had a very great calming manner. Never got upset about anything. Some people get upset and whatever. You never saw Geneva Boykin get upset. And so those two stand out in my mind.
Okay. Are there any other, let's finish up talking about school, because we haven't even started. We're an hour into this thing, an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And,
do you need to take a break?
No,
Okay,
I'm fine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't even started on your career.
Okay.
So are there any other thoughts either about the coursework you took or the people you were with or the experiences you had about being a student at Grady that stand out or that you want to discuss?
While I was there, no. But after I graduated and looking back, I wish we had had more experience outside the hospital setting, because my career led me outside the hospital setting as an RN. And Grady taught you how to be a hospital nurse. Mm-hmm. It gave you a great foundation and the great basis that you could take and go from there. But I had to really educate myself and work hard to get the skill set I needed once I left the hospital setting. And that's the part that Grady did not do.
Do you know whether or not that changed closer to the time that they closed?
I don't think it's even changed today that much, because I have a niece who's an RN, mm-hmm. and you learn in the hospital. In general.
For programs.
You might have a day or two where you go follow a public health nurse. We never went into what used to be called industrial nursing. It's now called occupational health, which I specialized in. We knew it existed. In fact, my mother was the one who suggested, after I started my career, you might like industrial nursing, Judy. If you ever get an opportunity, look into it, because it existed from the very beginning. Metropolitan Life hired the first industrial nurses in the early 1900s. So it was out there, but we didn't get any exposure to it and any specific training. And it's hard to do that, because you can go so many different ways now in nursing. I understand why that's hard. But looking back, I wish there had been a little more exposure to the other avenues outside the hospital setting.
Mm-hmm. And that might be difficult to do when you're so closely affiliated with a hospital.
And a diploma school is a hospital-based program, period.
Right.
That's what they were, that was their mission statement, really, was to train you as a hospital nurse. Knowing full well many would go out of that, but that was their mission.
Mm-hmm. Now, with all the studying and all the day-to-day work that you had, you still had time for a social life.
Yeah.
Talk about what it was like in general, to have a day off and to go out to the city and mm-hmm. things like that.
Well, Atlanta's great. I loved Atlanta. Absolutely loved Atlanta. Didn't have a car, okay, but they tried to get you when we were freshmen. That first couple of months, they would take us by bus to meet and greet at Emory for fraternities and stuff like that, and Georgia Tech, and they would bring students in, and we'd have a little social, thing with, punch and things like that. And they used to have dances. We never had a dance. Now, we did have, I take that back, we did have one dance a year, and it was like the Valentine's dance, and they'd have the king and the queen and stuff like that. So they tried to get you to that. They didn't have any money to bring in entertainment or things like that, but they tried. By the time we were seniors, the National League for Nursing had criticized Grady for the students not having enough social life. So they hired a lady by the name of Mildred Trotter, and her full-time job was to get us a social outlet. So she would go get free tickets to the theater or to Six Flags and things like that. Well, by then I had met my husband. He had a car. He was at Georgia Tech, and he lived on the campus there at Georgia Tech, which is right near Grady.
Did you meet him at one of those meet and greets?
No, what happened was on my very first day at Grady, how did I get that date? It was a blind date from the Georgia Tech meet and greet. And so I wouldn't do it without my sister. And she was at Agnes Scott. So we both had a Georgia Tech guy and his roommate. And they came and picked her up at Agnes Scott first, and then they picked me up at Grady. So we felt safety in the two of us going together. We did not want to go by ourselves to anybody we didn't know. And so we went out to a movie or something, and then went somewhere to get a hamburger or whatever. And then we ended up at Georgia Tech, and they were having Rush Week. And they were having lots of parties outside. And they were in Lambda Chi Alpha. And these guys we didn't like at all. They kept trying to get us up to the room and to get us to drink. And we were good girls. We weren't going to go up to the room, and we weren't going to drink. I was 17 years old. You know, that was the part that was new to me. And I just wasn't going to go there. So we kept refusing them. So they finally went their own way. And we were standing there in the courtyard. And I looked, and one of the fraternity guys serving the punch, I said, "Oh my gosh, that looks like Hutch Kinsman, the brother of my best friend in Wilmington, Delaware in 7th grade." I had not been in Wilmington, Delaware since, how old are you in 7th grade?
12, 13?
Yeah, 13. Okay, so 4 or 5 years ago. And we had written, my best friend and I, for years. And she ended up at Emory in nursing school, by the way. So anyway, I recognized her older brother, and we went over and we introduced ourselves, and he remembered us. And he took down our numbers and whatever, and we said, "Can you get us out of here? These guys just want to take us upstairs and all of that." And he says, "Let me go talk to the head of the fraternity," or something. I don't know what he did, but the guys came and took us home. They had to take us home. So I said, "No more blind dates, no more Georgia Tech guys, period." The phone rings. It's Hutch. "Judy, would you date my roommate?" And I go, "No more blind dates. I'll date you, but I won't date your roommate." He said, "Well, I couldn't get you on the phone first. I got Peggy on the phone, and she said the same thing. So she's my date, and you're stuck with my roommate." Well, it's my husband of 45 years. And I said, no. He's a Southern gentleman. I promise. He's a good guy. I promise. It'll be okay. And we'll double date. So if it doesn't work out, I'm there. And I said, okay. I never dated anybody else. So that's how. And so then Al and I would go on study dates. Saturday we would go to the library at Georgia Tech, and we would study. And Georgia Tech did not have a female bathroom for years and years and years. Yep. So you'd have to go into a makeshift men's room, and there were the urinals and the little partition, and I got used to that. And in his class at Georgia Tech, I think there were just a handful of women, very few. So you stood out. So I'd be at the library at Georgia Tech with him, and all these guys would be there and all of that. And I'd go, "I guess you're the lucky one," or something like that. And he'd go, "I sure am." You know. So he was always glad to take me to Georgia Tech, and he was a gentleman. And then on Sundays we'd go to church and we'd study, or if we didn't have a lot to study, because he was also a good student and did very well in school. And finally, you know, I met his family and all of that. So he was my social outlet.
Okay. But I did interrupt you while you were talking about all the different things that they would try to plan for Grady. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We would do things like we'd have a Halloween party, and everybody would make a costume, and they would have, you know, refreshments, and they give you a prize. And I was Snoopy first year, and I won first prize. And one of my friends was Charlie Brown, and we did a little skit, and they loved it, and we did that. The next year we went as Siamese twins, so we got in one uniform and put the bib over both of us and the skirt, and we went as the two-headed Siamese twin. That was hilarious. So we had a lot of fun with that. The dance they'd have once a year, Al would go with me, and it was a formal dance, so that was very nice. It was always at a downtown hotel with a nice meal. We always had a Christmas banquet, which was fabulous. It'd be at the Marriott or some nice hotel with, you know, entertainment, and door prizes, and I was just, I'd never been in a big city hotel for a big banquet like that, and it was just glamorous to me. So it was great. So they did do that kind of stuff. Graduation was a big deal. Everybody went to graduation to congratulate those who graduated, and they always had a reception afterwards and things like that. So they tried to do things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what was it like after all that hard work?
It was a relief.
On the day of your graduation.
Oh, it was everybody. When we asked people last year to give us their favorite memory, many of them put graduation. And, it's true. You work so hard and you got there and you go, okay. But you know what? It went so fast. It literally went so fast. It was like, oh. And, and once I started working, I thought, oh, I wish I'd taken advantage more of that department or that doctor and taken more advantage of the facilities that were there. You did what you could and you did it, but there was so much available at Grady that if you took extra steps, you really got a good education. And if you found a good doctor who was a good instructor and didn't mind student nurses bugging them and stuff like that, oh, you learned so much stuff. And, that was the great thing about it. They knew it was an educational facility and they were open to that. So that was good. My mother told me, she said, don't date a doctor. She said, it's the wrong way to go. And as it turned out, I met this Georgia Tech engineer the second date, so I never had an opportunity to date. But several med students and doctors would come up to me and go, do you have a special beau or something? And I could tell they wanted to ask me out for a date, and it was always no. And I made the right choice. Few of the girls dated doctors, and it didn't go well. Yeah, they were too young. See, these doctors
they were dating, I'm sorry.
They were 17 and 18-year-olds dating 24 and 25-year-old men. By the time they were interns and residents,
okay,
they were in their middle 20s.
So they were learning from the men who were asking them out. Mm-hmm. It seems like there would have been a policy against that.
Years ago there was, but there wasn't when I was there.
Okay.
Yeah. And several married doctors, and they did fine. But, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My mother warned me. She said, no. She said, they're too old for you. They're too experienced. She said, if you want to date a doctor after you graduate and, you got some experience under your belt, she said, but it's not a great life,
Were you married by the time you graduated, or did you
I did.
Get married? Okay.
I married. We were allowed to get married, and we married, and we weren't going to get married till after I graduated, but I realized I had graduated in Beaufort High School, and my high school friends were in Beaufort, and my dad got out of the military and moved to Florida. So my family was in Florida. Nobody was in Beaufort anymore. And I didn't know where to have the wedding. And I decided, these are my friends now at Grady. Let me get married. I got married the quarter before we graduated so that my classmates can come to my wedding and the people that are important to me now. And so we decided to get married and went to Al's church to get married.
Okay.
And so I got married the end of my senior year. So
did your family come up for that?
Oh yeah,
uh-huh.
Oh yeah. Everybody came out. My sister was my maid of honor, and all of that. But yeah, but they were. My mom and dad said, "Don't get married down here. We don't know many people here, and you don't either.
Right.
Get married in Beaufort or get married in Atlanta, and we'll do that." And I planned the whole thing.
So when you were married, were you allowed to live off campus, or did you have to?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
In fact, if you were married, you were not allowed to live in the dorm unless your husband was serving in the military or something.
Okay.
So we got a little apartment out by Lenox Square, and it was just 3 months that we were married. And Al was in graduate school by then, so he would drop me off in the morning and go to school, and then pick me up in the afternoon. And I only had the last semester, and the last semester was easy. Okay. There wasn't much left to do.
Okay.
So that worked out fine. In fact, the day I got married, we took our NLN final exams, and I was handing out the exams to the class. And they all looked at me, and because they all knew that was my wedding day, and they were coming to the wedding, and they go, "We cannot believe you are taking the NLN exams and getting married in the same day, Judy." And I go, "What?" And they go, "We're nervous about the exams. We would be nervous about exams and getting married." And I said, "Well, the time frame is so short. I have to do it this way."
So then you got your first job right after.
I worked at Grady.
Or it looks like about a year you were there.
Right. Al was still in graduate school, so we were allowed to work for pay, 1 8-hour shift a week, and that's how I made my money, and that's how I, did anything. So once we were allowed to work for pay, I worked every single Saturday from then on for almost 3 years. And fell into that. I started working on the 4A and B, which were the surgical units where they put the burn patients. And they would pick me to work with the burn patients. And so I got to be pretty good at working with burn patients. And as you well know, Grady is the center of excellence for burn patients even to this day. And so when I got ready to graduate, the supervisor of those 2 floors, that whole floor, came to me and she said, Judy, the head nurse position is yours if you want it the day you graduate. Well, Al was in Air Force ROTC, the Vietnam War was going, and he knew, he had to go into the Air Force. And we did not know we were going to end up. And so I told her, I said, I do not know where I'll be a year from now. I said, Al will be out of graduate school and he will immediately be taken up by the Air Force and we'll have to move. And I'm not going to be that for 1 year. Just give me a staff position. But if you will give me a straight day position, I'll work for you. But I don't want to be the head nurse just for 1 year. And she said, I'll take you anyway you'll come. Yes, you can have a straight day position, which was unusual as a new graduate. Usually got the graveyard shift. And so she gave me a straight 7-3 position. And that worked out perfect for us. So I could, he could drop me off in the morning, go to graduate school and pick me up and all of that. And then, he did, it was transfers before, I'm trying to think. Before he graduated, the Air Force took him right in, and he was sent to Edwards Air Force Base. He was a rocket scientist at that time. And they took him right in, and he was there for a couple months before I went out there.
Okay.
Of course, by then we were expecting our first child.
Okay. And I'm sorry, to Kingsport?
Okay, well, we were out at Edwards Air Force Base, and I didn't work there, had our first child, and then we moved to Kingsport, Tennessee.
Okay.
And I decided then that I wanted to work part-time to keep my skills and my license up. So the local hospital there put me up on a combination medical, surgical, and psychiatric floor. It was a nightmare.
Was it a smaller hospital than Emory had been?
Grady?
Grady, sorry.
Yes, anything smaller than Grady. Grady was the largest hospital under one roof when I was there, 1,100 beds. And this hospital probably had 400 beds. So it was a big community hospital, and they did pretty much everything. Wasn't a Grady, but whatever. The problem was, in the 70s, there was an extreme shortage of nurses. And they really had a hard time getting nurses. A lot of nurses got burnt out very quickly and raised their families and got out of nursing. A lot of my classmates, didn't even work after they graduated. They were so glad to be done with it, whatever. But I wanted to keep my fingers in it. So they hired me, and I worked 3 to 11, 2 nights a week on this combination unit. And the way they solved their shortage of nurses is they went to the Philippines, and they hired graduates from schools there who could speak passable English, and they housed them in a dormitory and brought them to this Northeast Tennessee hospital to do nursing. And they put them with a few American nurses. So when I would report on, I would at 3 o'clock, and I would be the head nurse, or the what you call the charge nurse for the shift. Even working 2 days a week, I was the charge nurse. These Filipino nurses would give me the report, and their English was horrible. And their nursing skills suffered because of it. And we had a terrible incident where I came in one time and they said, Mr. Smith had this terrible day. His blood sugars are up, then they're down. We've got him on insulin, and then he crashes, and he's about died 3 times today, and we don't know what we do, and we can't figure it out. Well, Mr. Smith was in there for a severe urinary tract infection, and the way they treated it, they put a catheter in him and had an IV bag running antibiotics directly into the bladder. And that's very common. Not only do you take IV antibiotics and oral IV antibiotics, but if it's really bad, sometimes they'll do that. And so he was a diabetic. So in those days, we did not have the little glucometers where you check the blood sugar very quickly. You did a dip test to the urine to determine how much sugar was in the urine, and based on this little scale, you would give him insulin. So I walked in and I looked, and I'm checking him out. I'm looking at the bag, and the bag was dextrose, which is sugar. They're running sugar with antibiotics into a bladder. Then they're getting the urine coming back out with the sugar in it and doing the dipstick. Of course it's got sugar in it. You're putting sugar in him and giving him insulin and crashing him. That's the day I decided I'm not sure I want to work in hospitals anymore. This state of this is so bad, I'm not sure I can live with this. It was the nurse's fault, but it wasn't the nurse's fault. Mm-hmm. They put her in a situation she really couldn't handle. It was, the lure of coming to America, this nice salary, we'll feed you, we'll put you in a dorm. They took anybody they could get with a warm body who had a diploma, and they couldn't figure out that simple thing, and about killed this patient. And I saw it time and time again. I was fighting fires.
Do you think that the regulations would have been better at a larger hospital?
I don't think it's so much the regulations, is that you cannot get people to come to a small town, and this was a small town in Appalachia. Okay. And their pool was so small, they had to entice somebody somewhere. So I decided I'm going to go to school and get my bachelor's degree. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to stop this. So I went over to East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, about half an hour away, and applied and got accepted. And before I could start, I found out I was pregnant with our second child, and I was very sick at that time with it, and I knew I couldn't do it both. So I just stopped. So I did not go back to nursing till we moved to South Carolina, and the children were in kindergarten and preschool, and I was anxious to get my fingers wet again. So I went to Lexington County Hospital, and they were trying out a new way of doing nursing called primary care nursing. We had what was called team nursing when we were at Grady and at Halston Valley. The RN was in charge, and under her was a hierarchy of skilled people. You had the RN, who usually did the IVs, the doctor's orders, the rounds, the complicated procedures, and most of the medications, and oversaw the LPNs and the aides and the orderlies who did the bedside, the bed baths and the changing the linens and cleaning people up and walking them down the hall and feeding them and stuff like that. Well, Lexington County decided to try this new thing called primary nursing, where every patient had an RN and she did total patient care. So if they puked, you cleaned it up. If their bed needed changed, you did it. Well, that's kind of what we did as students. So, okay, I can do that. That's no problem. The problem is they had a ward with 2 wings, and each wing had over 20 patients, and they had 2 RNs and a ward clerk who sat at the desk and answered the phone and called you if you were needed. And it was 3 to 11, and you had 20-something patients. And as time went on, patients in the hospital in the 1900s weren't as sick. They were sick, but, if you had a baby, you stayed in for a week. Now you're gone in 24 hours. The patients are sicker and sicker and sicker. So out of the 20 patients, every single one of them had an IV, and 3 were on respirators, and most of them couldn't feed themselves. That's absurd. And 3 to 11, the doctors in private practice close their private practice and come over to the hospital and start wanting a nurse to follow them down the hall to give orders to and to tell them what needs to be done and whatever. And it's an impossible situation. So I would go in, I was working 3 to 11, I would go in 1:30, 2 o'clock and set up all my IVs for the night, all my meds for the night, get all my procedure trays ready, read all the charts, have everything ready, and get report, because I didn't have time to do that once the other nurse left. And then would go up and down that hall like a banshee. Never ate, never went to the bathroom for the 8 hours. It was a zoo. The shortage of nurses was so bad in the 70s. And then when the night nurse came on and I would give her the report and hand off to her, would be the first time I'd write one piece of paper. I would sit down in the back charting room and pull out the charts. And I had scribbled, like vital statistics and stuff like that down. And I'd get all my little notes and I would chart for the whole night at that time. It was a nightmare. So my mother and I was talking, and I said, I don't know if I'm going to last in hospital nursing. It just frustrates me to no end that I cannot give the good nursing care I want to give, and the legal aspects of this and the liabilities start to worry people. Nurses were taking out malpractice insurance and everything like that because we knew it was so bad. And my mother said, if you ever get a chance to do industrial nursing, she says, why don't you try that? There was an ad in the Columbia paper. We lived outside Columbia, South Carolina, for a nurse for NCR Corporation, industrial nurse. I had no experience in it whatsoever, and it was a part-time job. It was 8 to noon, 3 days a week. And so I said, I'm going to go interview for that job. So I went and I got the job, and I kept the job at the hospital too, just in case. And once I got into that plant, and it had, 300 to 500 employees, and half worked on a line putting together computers, and the other half were all clerical and engineering jobs sitting at a desk. So it was a nice mix, and it wasn't heavy industry. It was a very light industry, sitting there working on boards and all of that. And I loved it.
Yeah. So for people who might not know the difference between industrial nursing and hospital, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious what hospital nursing is, but how did industrial nursing differ from that?
Well, it depends on who you're working for and what your population base is. And my population base there was, like I said, half light industrial and half professionals and secretarial. And they wanted somebody there that would teach first aid and CPR, do some health education classes, maybe quit smoking, weight loss, anything like that. And it was kind of a marketing thing for companies to have a nurse, and it was good PR. We have a nurse. And so once I got there and I started teaching the classes, they would come to me and they'd say, I know this is probably not your job, but I need to tell you something. And they would tell me some medical problem they were dealing with that they weren't getting good medical care for or didn't know the direction. So I would then try to help them and refer them to the right specialist, get them an appointment, and they loved it. They would love it. They would come in sick. Monday morning, the line was an ant trail out the door. All the guys who had an injury from playing sports that weekend, who sat at desk all week long, would come in with their ace bandages on, and they hadn't been to the ER because they were waiting for Judy. I became their nurse. And the guys who had chest pain and their wives tried to get them to go to the doctor, no, I'll see Judy Monday morning, would be standing in that line too. I can't tell you how many heart attacks I sent to the ER, standing in a line outside my door on Monday mornings. And so I realized I can be of value here. I can do something. And usually you're hired through the human resources department as the nurse or the safety department. And this particular place, it was human resources. And the human resources director would come in and he goes, I can't tell you how much people love you. He says, that's all I hear is, this is the best nurse we've ever had. We absolutely love her. I would go out on the floor and start to see what they did. Nurses never got out of the office before, and I would go out, and I love industry. So I would see how they made the computers, and I'd look at the hazards and the things they were exposed to, and I'd start to put two and two together, and I'd go, okay, this person sits at this desk all day long, bent over. No wonder their neck hurts them and things like that. So I started to self-teach myself. And I started to get books and stuff like that, and really fell in love with it. And so I then quit my job at the hospital because it became unbearable. And I quit that, and I did this, and then we were transferred again. And so then we came back to Atlanta.
Okay. And then that job was only, you said, about 12 hours a week?
Yeah. Yeah. So I could get what happened was, I could get the kids to preschool in the morning, and when they got out at noon or 1 o'clock, if I paid for lunchtime, then I could get them. So my kids weren't,
Yeah.
I didn't have problem. My number one priority was always my family. It took precedence over my career. Always did. Don't regret that one bit. Yeah.
But then you also sort of finally found a place that you liked.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it was more a case of other hospitals not sort of living up to Grady and its reputation and its abilities? Or do you think that maybe if you had known about industrial nursing, you would have just gone?
I think it was a combination.
Okay.
I really do. I was terribly discouraged in nursing. It was a love-hate thing by them with me. I loved it when I could do what I knew what to do, and I hated it when I had to tell patients' families, don't go home because I won't have time to feed your father. I am it with this whole hall. Would you stay and feed your father? I had to do that, and I hated that. They needed a rest too. And they would look at me and go, yeah, we'll stay. That was the state of nursing in those days.
And that was widespread, not just in smaller towns. Okay.
That was widespread.
Okay. So let's take a break here. I'm going to pause. So this is Tracy Drummond back with Judy after lunch, Judy Clary. And we had just finished talking about her first industrial nursing position at NCR Corporation. And that was from 80 to 81. But it looks like you guys had to move.
Yeah, Al's job took us back to the Atlanta area. And by then, my kids were in elementary school. And we actually lived near the Chattahoochee when the missing children tragedy happened, that Wayne Williams incident where children were being kidnapped and killed. And they were finding the bodies along the Chattahoochee. So I was very protective of the boys and decided not to go back to work for a while. But then they caught him, and I wanted to be back in industrial or occupational health nurses, as it then became known as. And saw an ad in the paper again, and this was with Wausau Insurance Company. And they had a regional office in Atlanta, kind of near Chamblee. And they, again, wanted a part-time occupational health nurse for their employees. So I went and interviewed, and I got the job, and I worked 8 to noon Monday through Friday. It was perfect. I could get the boys on the school bus. They were at school. I could get home before the school bus came. So that was always very important to me, and that allowed me to do it. That job wasn't that busy. I did stay there for a number of years because they taught me a lot.
Well, how did it differ from the NCR Corporation? Because it seems like going into an insurance company, you would have...
it was all office workers.
Okay.
There was no industry.
Okay.
It was all office workers. But I was the occupational health nurse for their whole southeastern region, so I had multiple offices in several states. And what they wanted me to do was not just teach them first aid and CPR and be their person they could talk to about medical issues, but they also wanted me to evaluate disability cases of the employees, not of policyholders. So if employees went out sick, I would get paperwork and I would evaluate their ability to come back to work and the readiness and, get the medical information from them and their doctors and, approve them to come on back to work when they're ready or not and things like that. They were very big on that. And, it was only 4 hours a day. And most of the office workers didn't have, they didn't have industrial injuries or things like that. So they were things like cancer and babies and things like that. But I did travel some and got to go to all the offices and meet some of the people and teach them first aid and CPR. And, very nice company to work with. It was during the time that we were discovering AIDS. And the company had a medical department with a full-time medical director, a full-time staff of nurses at their headquarters in Wausau, Wisconsin. They took me there. They gave me their training, how their philosophy ran, and I liked their philosophy. Their philosophy was that your medical information is private and confidential, and only the medical people get it, and the managers only got information on a very generic basis, like he'll be out for 6 weeks and when he comes back he can only work 4 hours a day or something like that. No diagnoses, nothing like that. It was up to the employees to tell what they wanted. So we had a confidentiality philosophy, and I liked that, and the employees' medical history was all confidential. Unfortunately, when AIDS came out, we had a gentleman who was in one of the satellite offices who was an adjuster. And he went out on disability, and he went out and he at first told me he had hepatitis. Well, he wasn't getting better, and he wasn't getting better. And I'd call him and check on him and make sure he was getting the right care and all of that. And he confided in me. I gained his confidence, and he told me he had AIDS. And the company had formed an AIDS policy. And it was very comprehensive. It was one of the first in the nation, and it was good. It was the right way to do things. And I told him not to worry. We had a confidentiality policy, and that he would be treated like any other illness, whatever. And he died. Some of the people that had contact with him would come and say, how's whatever, I don't remember his name, but let's say it was John. How's John doing? And, my response was always, I talk to him on a regular basis. Why don't you give him a call and ask him yourself? I don't give out medical information, whatever. Right. Well, my manager was the head of the Human Resources Department, and he took it upon himself one day before the man died to go visit him. So he traveled it was in another state, to visit him. And my manager had had a kidney transplant. And so he was immunocompromised to some degree, but not bad. He can come to work, he could go out in public and all of that, but he always worried about getting sick and losing this kidney that he'd been given. And I did not know he went to visit this man, although it wouldn't have made any difference at all to me if he went to visit him. What was I going to say? Don't go visit him, he has AIDS? No. We knew then that AIDS was only transmitted through, blood and bodily fluids. So, did not know he went to visit him. And when the gentleman died, we all knew he died, and we just knew he died. His his death certificate was sent to the Human Resources Department so that the family could get his benefits. And on the death certificate, it said he died of AIDS. So my boss saw it then. I got called into my boss's office, and I was screamed at for 2 straight hours for not telling them that the employee had AIDS. I took it and kept my mouth shut and let him scream because I understood his fear, because he told me then he had visited him. And I thought, okay, this is why I'm getting this, because he'd gone to visit him. So when he finally calmed down and I got to say something, and I said, well, I'll call my boss, Mr. Smith. I said, well, Mr. Smith, I said, number one, I didn't know you were going. Number two, it didn't matter. We have a confidentiality policy here that I followed to the T. And number three, if you didn't share needles or bodily fluids, you have nothing to worry about. You don't know this. And he screamed and yelled at me for another 30 minutes. And I said, well, I can understand your concern. Have you seen your doctor? Have you talked to your doctor? Yes, I called him immediately. And I said, well, what did he say? And he said the same thing you said. If I didn't share needles or share bodily fluids, I'll be fine. But you should have told me. It was your job to tell me this. And I said, no, it was not my job to tell you that. I not only have a job, but I have a license to practice nursing. And there's an ethical standard that I go by. If I don't follow my standards as an RN, I can lose my license. You can fire me if you want to, but I will still have my license. And that's not the way it works. Well, what happened is he told the vice president of the region, and he also was mad at me. Before then, I got all kind of awards from the company. I was their star employee.
What do you think made them so mad about? Because he could have had something far more contagious that would have been airborne.
The fear of AIDS. The fear of AIDS at that time in the United States was rampant. The stigma was beyond anything we had seen in our lifetime. It was just horrendous, the fear of AIDS. We didn't know how to treat it. People were dying left and right. It was an epidemic that was out of control. And he was immunocompromised, so he felt I had been disloyal to him, and thus his boss felt I had been disloyal to the department too. Well, I called the medical director right away, and I said, I forget his name, Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, let me tell you what happened. And Dr. Jones said, you did it exactly right. You followed everything we wrote about and talked about. And I said, you're going to have to back me up on this, because these guys are so mad at me. They are now taking my work away from me. And I sit at a desk for 4 hours and they won't let me do my job.
Do you think it was easier for them to be angry with you because you were a woman?
I don't think that mattered at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that mattered at all. Interestingly, before the gentleman died and he and I, had a rapport, he had told his doctor what a wonderful company he'd worked for, and that we had an AIDS policy, and that the nurse was taking care of it, and it was fine. And the doctor called me, and he said, Judy, he said, you're one of the first companies I've heard of who has the right kind of policy, and I'm going to testify at the U.S. Senate about the proper way for workplaces to handle AIDS, and I want you to come with me and testify. Will you do that? And I said, well, I'll have to ask my boss if I can do that, because I'll be representing the company. And before we got that far, the man died, and the whole thing blew up. After he died, I called the doctor, and I told him I was real sorry, that the patient died, and I knew he took good care of him. And he said, well, I think we're getting a plan now. We can go testify. And I said, I can't. He says, why not? And I said, let me tell you what happened. And I said, so I cannot represent a good company anymore. And corporate did nothing to protect me. They pretty much told him, you can't fire her. She didn't break any policy. She didn't do anything wrong. But they blackballed me and shunned me. I was even consulting with the other end of the insurance business for cases where they needed a medical opinion, and they would bring me those cases to the full knowledge of my boss and helping out other departments with medical issues, because they had other nurses they hired to do that, but they'd be out in the field and they need a quick answer, and they would come to me. And they took all work away from me, and I sat there and twiddled my thumbs. It wasn't a day and age where it did you any good to blow the whistle and hoped you could get another job. So I looked for the next job. I had been there for 7 years, and in those days you could be vested in retirement in 5 years. So I was vested in retirement, what little it was, and I got all kinds of awards from them for Employee of the Month, Employee of the Year, Nurse of the Year, all that kind of stuff. And I just found another job and left. And that's the way it was then. So that was my second occupational health job.
Was there anyone, even though there might have been an override, was there anyone that stepped up for you?
The employees were furious. The department heads who I helped saw what was happening, and their hands were tied. It was politics then. I could have gotten a lawyer, but what good did it do? It was a little part-time job. It was a stepping stone to me. It was a lesson that, you know what, Judy? Keep your license. You know what? And this was, till then, this was a stellar company to work with. They did everything right. They are no longer in business. They were bought out by another company. And last year, I started receiving my retirement check from them of $20 a month.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about how that ended.
And that kind of stuff happens.
But I imagine that that's more than just saying, oh, well, I need to find another job. I mean,
that job was going to develop into a full-time job. I was on my way to becoming more, once my boys were old enough and I was comfortable working full-time, they had told me, anytime you want full-time, Judy, you've got a position here. We will keep you. You can do anything we give you. And that ended that. My boss apologized to me after it. He was a good man. He was a good boss. He was scared. I knew that. And I told him, I said, I understand you had to get it out and scream at me. I didn't cry. It was hard because he was a great boss, and he promoted me. He loved me. He got me all these awards and all of that, but he was scared. So to him, it was personal at that point, and I understood that. But later, he came up to me and he said, this too shall pass, Judy. He says, we have these hiccups in our careers. And he said, you understand where I was coming from. I said, I absolutely 100%. But you have to understand where I was coming from too. And the two just didn't meet. He said, I thought on a personal basis, you would have been more loyal to me than to the company policy. And I said, then you don't understand who you hired. And when I interviewed, I told him that. I said, I will let you know, I will not do anything unethical. If someone asks me, the answer is no, and you can fire me. I said, you will get a professional who treasures her license and has a moral compass. And my job is to do the right thing for the company and the employee. And if it's not the right thing for both of them, I will do the right thing morally. And if you don't like it, then you do whatever. But that's the way I'll do. And they said, that's exactly the person we want. And they got what they wanted.
Well, but that apology didn't turn into him sort of trying to protect you more?
No. It was over.
Okay.
It was over then.
I mean, was it that he was remorseful once he sort of saw what the outcome was for you?
I think if I had stayed in contact with him for years and he knew he didn't get AIDS and he was fine, and as more people realize, yes, we can take care of people with AIDS and we can be exposed to people with AIDS without catching it, and that fear, because it was an unbelievable fear, had kind of dissipated. I think he probably was remorseful because he was a good man, but he was just frightened, and I understood that.
Well, I'm sorry that your time with them ended that way.
Mm-hmm.
But you said you found Rockwell International?
Yeah, what had happened is I was had a guy in my Sunday school class who was in charge of the safety department at Rockwell International, and I mentioned what had happened, and he said, one of my nurses quit. He says, come and interview with us. So I went and interviewed with Rockwell International, and that was a full-time job. So that was my first going back full-time. By then, my boys were in, one was in high school and one was in middle school. So I felt more comfortable being gone a little longer for them. And went to Rockwell, and they had an LPN, and then hired me, and we had a secretary, and they had 2 manufacturing facilities. It was the Missile Systems Division that makes the Hellfire missile that they used during Desert Storm in Duluth, Georgia. And there were some top secret areas, and it was medium industrial, not super heavy industrial, other than the chemical and explosives that they didn't put there, but they built the components of the missile. Okay. And I loved it, being back in the industry. The problem I had there was my boss would give me directions to do something. He'd say, I want you to do a quit smoking program and get it up and come present it to me. So I'd make a quit smoking program and call him up and say, okay, I got it all ready. Can I come present it to you and see if that's what you want? I changed my mind. let's do one on heart disease. So then I do one on heart disease, and I call him, and he'd say he changed his mind. After 3 times doing that, I realized he really didn't want a program. He just wanted the farce of saying, we're going to start to do a program. And he was very ineffective. He wasn't a good boss at all. And I didn't have anything to do. I wanted to do more. Didn't have a lot of injuries or stuff like that. And the LPN was a liar, unfortunately. She was having affairs with some of the guys, and she was sneaking out and not coming to work and all of this. And finally, I said, this place isn't for me. And so I found my next job. And when I left, the vice president of the division came and sat down with me. And he said, why are you leaving? You've already developed an excellent reputation with the employees, and we really like you to stay. And I said, you've got some issues here. I said, I don't want to accuse anybody, but your LPN in the main office. He goes, yeah, I know. I said, you need to look into that. It's not painting a good picture, and somebody's going to get hurt. And he goes, yeah, we're looking into that. And I said, and it's really hard to work for this one boss because everything I presented to him, he changes his mind, and I'm just spinning my wheels with him. He goes, yeah, we're about ready to get rid of him too. And I just had found another job that I thought would be better and said, I'm going to go. So I didn't stay there very long. Okay. Yeah.
And that next job was at the Lovable Company.
Yeah. And Lovable was a privately owned ladies' undergarment company in Beaufort, Georgia, started by the Garson family many years ago.
Was it manufacturing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It was a cut and sew operation. So they worked 10 hours a day, Monday through Thursday. So that was your 40 hours, and you had Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off. And I thought, that's not a bad schedule. And my boys then were both in high school. So went and interviewed with them, and they'd had a nurse for years and years and years, and she was a Band-Aid giver. That's all she did. And they thought that's what they wanted and they needed till I got there. So I got the job, and I started reorganizing things and started to realize OSHA had come out with the OSHA standards in 1970. And what year was Lovable? I got it on there.
Lovable was 88 to 90.
Okay, so the OSHA standards had been out for quite some while, and I had gone over to Emory University and taken courses in occupational health nurses, got a certificate through them. I had studied on my own and took all kinds of courses to become an expert in occupational health and medicine, and got board certified through the American Association of Occupational Health Nurses, which is a 2-day test. It's like getting your RN license. It's grueling. It's absolutely grueling. And got that, so I was very proud of that. That was like my master's degree by that town. And so I started asking questions, and I said, well, who does your material safety data sheets when the chemicals come in? Because any manufacturing facility has chemicals, whether they think they do or not. And they go, what are those? And so I told them what they were, and the human resources director pulled out this box, and she says, yeah, these things keep coming to me. I throw them away. What are they? And I said, oh, you have to keep these on your chemicals, and you have to train your people in them, and you have to post them, and you have to keep catalogs. And things have to be labeled now. And she goes, well, I'm going to call our lawyer and find out. And I said, fine, do that. So she called her lawyer, and he was not a good labor lawyer. And he says, no, you don't have to do that. You're not big enough. And I knew it was wrong. So I just kept pushing, and I kept bringing back more and more information. And they had a very small, informal safety organization. And finally got the president of the company and her together, and I presented to them. And I said, look, I really want to do a good job here, and you're not following the law. I know what the law is on occupational medicine, and this is this and this and this. And I'll be glad to talk to your lawyer or whatever, but we need to be doing some things, or OSHA's going to come in here one day and they're going to cite you for negligence, and it's going to be big bucks. And that's all you have to say, big bucks, in a privately owned company, and you get their attention. And Mr. Garson said, I believe this girl. Let's get the lawyer on the phone right now. And we got the lawyer on the phone, and he goes, oh, yeah, I think she's right. And so he said, what do you need? And I said, okay. I said, let me go through the plant and let me catalog every single chemical you have and container, and let me label them, and let's start a hazardous communication program. And you've got some equipment that's a little loud. Georgia Tech has an outreach program for noise and audiometrics. I'd like to do some hearing testing and some sound level testing. And I had a whole list ready for him. And he says, oh my gosh, you do know what you're talking about. And I said, you need to protect these people from the hazards, and you have hazards. And we need to do it now before you get in big trouble. And I started the hazardous communication program. I made my own video. They didn't have much money for me, so I couldn't buy things. I went and cataloged all the chemicals, and they were putting chemicals in old Coca-Cola bottles and not labeling them. And I would find these things under a counter, and I'd say, okay, what is this, Mary? And they go, well, that's that chemical I use when I need to bleach the material. And nobody knows what it is but me. And I said, well, where's the original container it came in? And it took me about 6 months, but I finally got them convinced to stop doing that and got everything labeled, trained all the employees, got it all straight. And then I called Georgia Tech, and their outreach program was great for industry, and it was free. And I got them to send out some professionals with sound level meters, and we did a sound survey of the whole plant. And one specific area, the people were being exposed to 102 decibels, 10 hours a day. And they never had studied it. They never put hearing protection on them. So I got one of the engineers, and we tried to engineer it out, which is your first step in occupational medicine, is engineer out the hazard instead of putting people in personal protective. And we tried everything. We tried plexiglass, we tried cardboard, we tried muffles. The engineer and I would work on this, and we couldn't do it. We called the manufacturer, and they said, it can't be done. You have to put them in hearing protection. And we put that in our original literature that we sent to you, which had been there for like 10 years. So at that point, I said, okay.
This is really worker protection that you're doing.
That's exactly what you're doing.
Like sort of this advanced...
It's protecting their health from the hazards they're exposed to every day. That's what industrial medicine is. It's not Band-Aid putting on. It's bringing in a healthy workforce and keeping them healthy so that they go home healthy. So I put them all in hearing protection and trained them and all of that, and I took them out and got all their hearing tested, and they all had hearing loss. And they all could have filed a workers' comp claim for that, rightly so, and they would have won, and all of them were loyal to the company and wouldn't do it. They were just glad I found it before they lost their total hearing. So we stopped that, and then I love that job. Because I'm a go-getter and I'm independent. I don't need someone looking over me to tell me how to do my job. I learn how to do my job, and I'm very independent. And that's kind of the wanted to be the doctor versus the nurse in me, is I can be alone as the only medical person in a industrial facility and be the person that they come to. And if I can't fix the problem, I'll find the person who can fix the problem. You know, that kind of thing. So we did a tremendous safety turnover there and whatever. Then we got into ergonomic problems. What they did was they made bras and panties, thousands and thousands of them a day. And they would cut them on these big machines, and then by hand, they would hang them on the little hangers, and they were paid an incentive for the more they did. And I started studying them, and the women started telling me about symptoms like carpal tunnel and tendinitis. And I looked and watched them, and I did a time motion study on them, and I figured out, heck yeah, the women that are making the most money are getting carpal tunnel and tendinitis because you're paying them to do more than their bodies can handle in a 10-hour day. So I went to management, and I said, we've got to stop this incentive. You've got to have a different way to incentivize these people because they're hurting themselves, and you're going to start to get carpal tunnel claims and tendinitis claims because it's all in the news, and once they figure it out, and they are going to be disabled. And we have to stop this. And I gained respect and credibility there. And so we changed the whole dynamic of how people worked and never had a claim. We made it, you cannot do more than this in 10 hours. And you will take breaks, and we will do stretching exercises, and we will do that, and we'll just raise the salaries. The Garsons were great to work for. They really cared for their employees, and they listened. Once they were educated, they listened. I loved that job, but they didn't pay me anything. And I had 2 boys heading off to college.
Right. That's too bad, because, yeah, it really does sound like you loved it and that you were much needed there.
I loved it. I had a health fair every year, and we caught people with all kinds of diseases they weren't following up with their doctors on, that kind of thing. The funniest day that ever happened is they came in and they said, we're going to send Junior in to see you, and we want you to talk to him. And I said, what about? And they said, his body odor. And I said, that's not a nursing role. That's a supervisor's role. Do your job. No, the supervisor won't do it. You need to do it. And I said, why? He'll just take it better from you. We need to let you know that Junior murdered his wife about 12 years ago, and he served his time and got out on parole, and we hired him, and he's a good employee, but he does have drinking binges, and he does have a record. And I said, great. I never met Junior. They had like 600 employees.
Yeah.
And I thought, you don't pay me enough to do this. So they sent Junior in, and Junior stunk my whole office up in 1 minute. So Junior sat there, yes ma'am, yes ma'am. And I said, Junior, you know why you're here? And he said, no. I said, they didn't tell you? No. And I said, well, they're a bunch of chickens. They didn't tell you because they're afraid of you. And he said, you don't have anything to be afraid of me, Miss Clary. I said, I believe you. I said, you have body odor today. What's going on? He says, well, I went on a drunk Friday night. This was Monday morning. They put me in the slammer. They let me out in time this morning to come to my job, and I haven't had a chance to have a shower. And I said, Junior, you get a half an hour for lunch. Take your half an hour right now. Can you get home and go home, get a shower and change and be back in half an hour? He said, yes, ma'am. And I said, do it right now and then come back and see me before you go back to work. And Junior came back all clean and thanked me, and I thanked him, and we never had a problem with Junior again. But I thought that came home and I went, they don't pay me enough to do this job. So they pay me very little, and I was taking on more and more responsibility.
Well, not just responsibility, but you had pointed out things
that saved them money.
That could have cost them so much money. Things they were just like, whatever. I don't understand how that wouldn't be rewarded.
Well, what they did, they had a consulting firm come in because people were complaining about their salaries, upper management. So they hired an independent consulting firm, and they came in, and you had to write up your job description and what you did and all of that. And so I wrote it up and all of that. And when it came out, they came to me and they said, the consulting firm said, you're the most poorly paid employee here in a salary position, and that we need to triple your salary for what you do. But we can't. We just don't have the money. And I said, okay, I understand. And about that time, I got a call from Bell South Telecommunications that said they were starting a new disability case management department downtown Atlanta, and would I be interested in talking to them? And they gave me the salary range, and it was triple what I was making.
Wow.
And I had 2 boys going. I had one going to private high school and one going to college. So I chose my family.
Of course.
Yeah.
And in 1990, went to work for Bell South Communications.
Yeah. So there, what they did, they were self-insured and self-administered for their disability and for workers' comp, not for their health care. If you got cancer, they had, a policy that the company helped provide the premium. But if you went out on disability or you were hurt, it came directly out of the company's kitty. And they were a union, the Communication Workers of America, and there was a big entitlement syndrome at Bell South. People stayed there for their entire careers, and they got used to be entitled to great benefits, good jobs, and good facilities, and people started taking advantage of their disability program. And people would go out for, I am not exaggerating, they would go out for an ingrown toenail for 2 weeks because they couldn't sit and answer a phone with a throbbing toe. And they decided, we got to put an end to this. This is costing us too much money.
Right.
So they formed a disability case management department. They reorganized, and the phone company reorganizes all the time, I found out. And this was a baby Bell. This was after the breakup of the original Bells. It has since come back to AT&T. So they wanted nurses who had experience with occupational medicine, dealing with people in a workplace setting, and what it took to come to work, and what the exposures were to work, and nurses who had experience with workers' comp and the system and how it worked, and also people who were RNs and could evaluate the medical material that came in. And we would literally look at and determine how long was a reasonable period of time for this person to be out based on their job requirements, their medical history, and all of that, and approve their disability based on that. So they formed this whole team of us, and I think we had about 10 RNs, and we all had one clerical person each because the paperwork was tremendous. And they set us up on I think it was the 21st floor downtown Atlanta, and we did it all telephonically. And they had several states, and we divided it up by state and alphabetically. So I had the state of Florida, J through Z, last name. So anybody in Florida who worked for the phone company who went out sick more than 3 days had to have paperwork, go on disability, had to be approved by me. Paperwork had to go back and forth, medical stuff and all of that, and you'd call and talk to them and all of that. And we had guidelines. We had specific scientific guidelines that said this is the normal period of time. You know, if they get an infection, of course, it's different. If they're diabetic, it's different. If they have heart disease, all of those parameters we had to look at. And we were very generous. We weren't, overly strict, but we tried to follow the guidelines. So I did that for a couple of years. But I really got tired of not seeing people face to face and having to do it all by phone. And I really missed my industrial setting. And Al got transferred again.
Okay.
So we went back to Kingsport, Tennessee.
Okay.
And when we got there, I didn't think I'd be able to find an occupational job. And in the occupational nurses newsletter for East Tennessee, there was an ad for the Mead Paper Company looking for an industrial nurse, and it was down the street from where Al was working. And I saw it, and we were in the process of moving, and so I sent them my resume and a letter, and they called me the day we moved into the house and said, we just got your resume and your letter, and we have interviewed everyone we wanted to see, and we were going to make a decision tomorrow based on the pool we have. But the nurse who's here, who's going to retire, said, when she looked at your stuff, no, you need to interview this one. And so we're going to hold it off for 1 day. Can you come in tomorrow and interview? And my moving truck was coming the next morning. And I thought, well, you don't want to miss this opportunity. Okay. So I said, yes, I'll be there. It lasted all day. My husband has handled multi-million-dollar contracts with the government and with big companies, and he has never interviewed like I have. It's called a targeted selection process. And I went in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they had a team of 3 people, and they all had specific questions they wanted to ask me, and they kept asking me, the one guy, what's the worst injury you ever handled at work? Give me another example. And I had not been in heavy industry, and a paper company is heavy industry. Every risk, chemical, mechanical, psychological, ergonomic, you name it, is in a paper mill. And I told him, I said, I've had sewing needles through fingers, I've had heart attacks, I've had cuts, but I've been in light and medium industry, and I don't have experience in heavy industry. And give me another example. And finally, I just said, look, it sounds like you need a trauma nurse, not an occupational health nurse. I said, if you want a nurse who can take a safety department and look at your risk and try to mitigate them and keep these people safe, I said, and change things, that's my proven record. If you need a nurse who all she's doing is splinting people and getting them to the ER every day, I'm not your person. I don't want to work for a place that has that kind of stuff going on every day. I want to work for a place that keeps their employees safe. So we can end this interview right now if you really need a trauma nurse. And he says, no, the interview will continue. And he stopped asking me the same question. So when we got done with that, which was 3 hours long, he said, I want you to go out to lunch with our occupational medicine consultant, Dr. Breeding, down the street, who comes in, and he's our medical consultant, but we just hire him to come in when we need him, and go to lunch with him. And I said, okay. So I called out and said, I think I'm going to be here a while. So I went out to lunch with Dr. Breeding and talked to him, and he says, oh my God, they need you. He says, the one they were going to handle is an ER nurse. And I said, well, that's what it sounds like they need. He says, no. He says, that's not what they need. You can come in here and help clean this place up, and you can do it, and you're my recommendation right now, he says. And I said, well, tell me what it's like to work for these people, and he says, well, the one that asks you all the question is a what. He says, but just stand up to him and you'll do fine, and everybody else will be fine. And I said, okay. So I came back, and they had a new team of 3 people who started the interview from the very first question all over again. And crazy. They hired the nurse like they're hiring the president of the company. So I went through all that with them and went home and got a phone call from the man that was the hard guy to get along with, and he says, well, we made our decision and we'd like to offer you the position. So we negotiated the salary, and I said, well, at this point in my career, I said, I need 3 weeks vacation. You don't have to pay me for the 3rd week if you only give 2 weeks, but I need 3 weeks vacation. I have 2 boys in college away, and I need the time. And if you need to ask someone higher up for permission to do that, I can wait for your answer. Well, he was an egotist, and he goes, I don't have to ask anyone. Yes, you get the 3 weeks paid. So he teased me about that later. We got along fine once he knew what I could do. So I got that job, and the first 3 days I walked into that paper mill, I threw up on the way to work. I was so afraid of the injuries that would be coming in my door.
Really?
Broken bones, toes, eye injuries, hearing, you name it. And they fired the safety manager the week after I got there, who was going to be my boss, and brought in a guy who knew what he was doing. And the 2 of us turned the place around.
And was it unionized?
Yes, it was unionized.
Because I find that paper mills often are,
yes,
perhaps because of the level of risk.
Yes.
That is.
It was unionized, and the people were the salt of the earth. Their fathers and grandfathers had worked there. The union tried to give me a little trouble the first week. They tried to interfere and came into my office while Dr. Breeding and I were evaluating a lady who was claiming an injury. And I put my foot down, and I went up to the union president, and I said, what are you doing here? This is a medical office. It's confidential. And he said, well, she wants me here. And I turned around and I looked at her, and I said, if you will give me and Dr. Breeding a chance, we will do the right thing for you, and we don't need the union involved in this. I will tell you, we will take care of you the right way, and we'll probably go above and beyond what the law requires. But if you get the union involved and they come into my office like this, I consider it interference, and it sets up a bad precedence. And I'm letting you know right now, I don't like this. And she looked at the union president, she looked at me, and she said, give her a chance. And they never asked to come in again. So I just wanted it to be professional.
Right, of course.
I didn't want it to be a thing. I'm the only one who had keys to the medical office and to the files and things like that. So, we kept it professional. And we turned the place around. When I got there, they had 60 open workers' comp cases that had been open for years, and were having broken toes and stuff, 100 OSHA recordables a year. When I left, we had 1 open workers' comp case, and I think we went 1 million man-hours without an incident. And it was true. It wasn't hidden. Some companies will hide stuff and play games. I didn't play games. I didn't play games. We turned the place around, the safety manager and I. So I was very proud of my time there. And what they did, Mead was the first employer, and it got bought out by Willamette. And Mead had hired nurses since the very day that paper mill opened in 1916. They're celebrating their 100 years this year. And when Willamette came in, Willamette had never hired nurses for any of their paper mills. And everybody got fired, and we had to interview for our jobs and be rehired, the whole plant, everybody. And when I interviewed, they told me, we don't hire nurses. And I said, look, I'm as much a safety professional now as I am a nurse. And I said, I have 2 boys in college, and I'm committed to keeping this place safe. And if you will figure out a way to keep me here, I don't think you'll be disappointed. And the higher ups told them, you find something for Judy to do because we're not losing her. You keep Judy. So they made me the benefits administrator. So I was the nurse on the side and the benefit administrator full time. Well, you know how that works. Once you're the nurse, you're always the nurse.
Right.
So I had 2 full-time jobs. So I would do the benefit administration along with the nursing. And
benefits administration, for someone listening that might not understand that concept, what is benefits administration?
I would sign people up for their benefits, life insurance, health insurance, dental insurance, disability insurance. I would send their paperwork off to the corporate office because they were self-insured. And they were third-party administered, but they were self-insured. I would help people file their claims. If they had problems and they didn't understand something, I would get in there and break up the gridlock, whatever was going on, and help them get things straight. So it was a lot of that kind of stuff. Well, then what happened is, and I love that job. Willamette was great. Willamette, they were not, they let you do your job without interfering. So we started a lot of new programs, hearing protection, all that kind of stuff. And then Willamette sold out to Weyerhaeuser. And Weyerhaeuser had nurses, but they wanted them all to be directed from the central office instead of locally, which was fine with me. I did that. And then what happened, we went through a succession of safety managers. The safety manager that was good got promoted out of safety, and they hired a succession of about 6 safety managers who were my bosses over a period of 3 years, and they didn't know what they were doing. They absolutely didn't know what they were doing. They were absolutely lost, and they'd get fired. And there'd be a next one, and they'd get fired. And finally, after the last one committed suicide, they came to me and they said, if you want to be safety manager, we'll let you be safety manager. And I said, well, that's a nice way to put it. How about putting it in a professional way? I was mad at them the way they did it. It was like, you're our last hope kind of thing. And I said, only if you really, truly will want me, because they never had a woman manager at the mill ever. And so they said, yeah, we want you to do it. Well, they had a hard time letting a woman be a manager. The managers in the other departments didn't respect what I said. They respected me as a nurse and a benefit administrator, but all of a sudden as a safety manager, I didn't know what I was talking about. And I still had 3 jobs then. I had safety manager, I had benefits administrator, and then I was also not really the nurse, but still the nurse. Mm-hmm. I did all the first aid and training and all that stuff and all of that. So I did that till it's got time to be retired. And so I retired.
Yeah, you were there the longest, 93 to 2006.
That was my longest job. Mm-hmm.
And it still sounds like it was that you never found a place that fully respected what you brought to the table.
There were always issues with being the female in a male-dominated industry, which the paper industry is. The other ones, I never had issues being a female, but being the only medical person in a business or an industry, you walk a fine tightrope. And as I told them at the beginning, I will do the right thing. It may be for the company one time, and it may be for the employee. You may not like what I say. I might say, yes, this is work-related. You might want to push it under the carpet, but this is work-related, and this one needs to be taken care of. And I took a case to the state Supreme Court that I knew wasn't work-related, and the company said, we went through the appellate court and everything, and I said, no, I got this one. I said, you need to fight this one. You need to let these employees know we do the right thing, but when you try to pull something on us, we also do the right thing. And I won that case. And they learned they couldn't pull the wool over my eyes, that kind of thing. And very few employees tried it. 95% employees want to do the right thing, and they want to be loyal to their company, and they want to do a good job, whether they're union or not. They really do. They really do. It's the few that give you 95% of your headaches, the 5%. So I really enjoyed that job till it got to be 3 jobs. I couldn't do anything when I had 3 jobs. I had so many. And I also was assistant human resources director by then, too. I forgot to tell you my 4th job. And the human resources director was running for mayor and head of the Chamber of Commerce, so he was never at work. So I got to do labor arbitrations and everything by then. So I learned a lot in my career.
I imagine. Yeah, it sounds like in that last job, definitely. Well, we're back down to 1 bar, which is concerning, in 50 minutes. So one thing we didn't talk about is you going back to school in the mid-'80s to get in Joliet.
Right.
So fill me in on that, because that is something that I neglected to ask about.
Because I had left the hospital setting and I was in industry, I wanted the respect of being college educated, and always felt I needed at least a bachelor's degree. And Joliet offered a program where RNs got full credit for their diploma school courses and their experience, and then filled in the rest. And you didn't get a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. You got a Bachelor of Science in Allied Health. And so that's what I did. It was wonderful for me because it gave me that credibility of having a bachelor's degree without having to be a BSN and go back in the hospital to do the BSN, because I knew I never was going to go back in the hospital setting. And so that was the right avenue for me. So I went ahead and got my bachelor's degree, and then got my board certification in occupational medicine after that. So I was continually studying, going to classes. You can see the stack of all the courses I took on my own over the years.
And were the courses, were you able to take them in Atlanta?
I took them all over.
Okay.
I took them all over. I'd take them correspondence courses. I would go to universities. Professional organizations have courses and they give you credits for things like that. So I take them anywhere I could get them. I got certified in audiometric testing, so I could do hearing tests and evaluate people for hearing loss, which is a week-long course. I got certified in pulmonary function testing so that I could follow the OSHA standards for respiratory illnesses in the mill. All those kinds of courses that you use when you get in the industrial setting. When you're the only medical person, you've got to be qualified in the hazards that those people are exposed to.
Okay. And you found that part of your career very rewarding.
Yeah, I also went to EMT school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I decided after I'd been out of nursing school for so long, and I was a American Red Cross CPR and first aid instructor since day one. They even put me on TV one time because I taught so many courses in Atlanta. And I just felt a need, there might be some new techniques or something that I might need to know, and being in heavy industry. So I went to the local college and took their EMT course just because I just felt it was something that would help me. What I found out is Grady taught me everything I needed to know, and they didn't teach me anything new. But that's okay. I found that out, that no, I had what I needed when I left Grady for this level.
Okay. Well, and that was my follow-up question. There have been a few times that you've almost read my mind, like what I was going to ask you next. But that was one. So, which was this: did Grady prepare you?
Mm-hmm. Grady prepared me to be a good nurse and to know that I could tackle anything if I put my mind to it and not be afraid of it. We were fearless when we left Grady because of the things we experienced at Grady. We really were. We were charge nurses when we were 18 years old on the night shift in a big city acute care hospital. Right. We knew how to take charge and to get things done and to do it. Yeah.
Do you remember hearing the news that the School of Nursing was going to close?
No. And I was living in Atlanta at the time. So when I found out it was closed, it was a couple years later, and I did not know.
Even after it had closed.
I did not know it had closed till several years after it closed. I forget how I found out. I think I was in Tennessee back by then, whatever. But they had a closing celebration and invited everybody, and I lived in Atlanta and didn't even know about it. They had a hard time communicating with people, I think.
Why is it? Because they closed in 82, and that was, my gosh, that's been
33 years ago.
33 years. Okay, 33 years ago. Why has it been so important to you to work as hard as you have the last few years to make sure that the legacy of the Grady School of Nursing is properly saved and preserved, and that people are able to learn about it?
2 reasons. Grady gave me my life. They gave me a profession that I've always been proud of, and a way to make a livelihood and be independent, and did a good job at that. It was a great school of nursing. It really was. Grady gave me a full scholarship for my second 2 years, and it was an anonymous donor, would not let me know who it was. And my dad was getting out of the military, and he couldn't borrow $300 for the second year. And I went to them and said, I need help. I'm going to have to leave if I can't find a way to pay the $300. And they said, go talk to Miss Wooten. She can work wonders. And many of us got a full ride our second and third years. And I found out, researching at Georgia State University, that Robert Woodruff paid for my thing. And as it turned out, my husband's family are Coca-Cola family, and his grandfather was a vice president of Coca-Cola in 1948, and the Woodruffs are family friends to this day, and didn't even know they paid my scholarship. And they didn't know they did either. It was all done through a trust or whatever.
Okay.
So it wasn't a personal thing. It just happened to work out that way. So I've always felt indebted to Grady and to whoever gave me that scholarship, and wanted to pay it back. So when I got called by Mary Ralph Foster, would you like to work on the reunion? Is there anything you'd like to do? I jumped in and said, yes. This is my opportunity to pay Grady back and tell them thank you, because I never could write a thank you note to an individual and say thank you.
Right.
I have since written a note to the one Woodruff we know is still alive. And she didn't know it, and she goes, oh my goodness, didn't know that, So that was a personal thing. I wanted to pay it back. And the second thing is, it's important. You well know, if we don't record this, it's going to be lost. And people need to understand how nursing has evolved, and how the diploma schools were so integral and important, and the only way to really get a professional nurse right after the Civil War, until the BS program started coming into play. And they staffed the hospitals. They trained thousands and thousands of women to have a career when women really didn't have careers. You were a school teacher, you were a secretary, you were the phone operator, you were a clerk, whatever. But to go into nursing and to be recognized and to uplift that profession from the dregs of society it used to be, these diploma schools did it. And they did it through sweat and tears, whatever. And so that history needs to be preserved. And it will never come back. The diploma school will never come back. It's not realistic. It's not the right way anymore to train people to be considered professionals. You need to have a collegiate, program. I would like to see the collegiate programs have more clinical training like we had. I think it's lacking. And I know through my niece, who didn't have the diploma training, and my sister, a younger sister, who didn't have the diploma program, they're just amazed at the stuff that I know and could do and did that they can't even imagine. And they think I had a better education than they had. So it's, multifold.
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to bring up or mention, or anybody you want to talk about? Or, I feel like we've had a very thorough interview.
Yeah. I've enjoyed working with Miss Dixon. you know, in the last year and a half on the reunion and then her book and being able to contribute to it. It's amazing that she has, at age 93 years old, has lived this long and been able to see her dream of finally getting her book printed. And I would pinch myself in the last year going to her house and working, and I tell her, I go, Miss Dixon, I can't believe I'm standing here with you. We didn't stay in contact at all. Mm-hmm. I really didn't know her, you know. And I said, I really don't know why it's me who gets to do this, because I consider it a privilege and an honor to do this. And one of my classmates said, she said, Judy, God has prepared you your whole life for this role. And this is what you're supposed to do. And you are the right person to do this. You and Mary are the right people to do this. And this is your destiny. And God has prepared you. And we wouldn't pick anybody else to do this. And I said, well, I appreciate that. And she said, just think about it that way. He's been preparing you your whole life to do this. And I said, well, it's been a gift. It has been a gift.
Anything else? Any final thoughts?
No. If I had to do it all over again, knowing what I know now, I'm ambivalent. I really am. Because there's so many more things I see women doing now that if I had the opportunity, I had the skills. I had the brain, but it just wasn't my time. So I don't regret it. I don't regret it. But, you know, I wished I'd had maybe the opportunity to become an MD. I do.
Actually, I thought of one more question. What has been the most important thing to you about the work you've done?
I think the most important thing is I tried, and this is occupational medicine, I tried to allow people to be the best they could be and to help them be the healthiest they can be, and also mentor them to be the best they can be so that the company we're working for had good employees who were productive and valuable and a resource for them. I always saw that as great value to these companies, to keep the employees healthy and to mentor them and teach them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, this has been a wonderful interview.
Thank you.
Like I knew it would be. You know, I've been waiting for a long time to get here and interview you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you.